I'm going to present this video as if you have no idea who I am and have never heard me speak, because even if that's the total opposite of true, it will still help you to get a better sense of the perspective that I'm coming into 2026 with, and it'll be easier for us to all stay on the same page if I'm not making any assumptions about what you know and you're not making any assumptions about what you know either. So, hi, let me introduce myself. My name is Trixie Stork. This is my husband, Bird Stork. I was born on August 8th, 1991, in the city of Oakland, California, although only because that is where there was a hospital and there wasn't one on the island of Alameda, which borders Oakland, and that's where my parents lived. By the time I was 1 year old, my parents had already moved from their original house on Alameda to another house on Alameda. By the time I was 2, they moved to Treasure Island, which is an even tinier artificial island in the San Francisco Bay. And by the time I was 3, I had a younger brother born in San Diego, where we were living by then. And by the time he was 2, we had moved back up to the LA area, living in Westminster. So if you know your California, you know that San Francisco is 8 hours north driving of San Diego, and that San Diego is 2 hours south driving of Los Angeles. And by the time I was 4 years old, we lived in Virginia, and that's where I grew up. I don't remember anything about California. All I know about it intellectually is that if I have any memories of being like earlier than 4, they must have come from there, but I don't think I do. And, my younger brother was born there, but I truly have only seen pictures. It's the only context I have into those first few years is through seeing photographs of them and being told things about them. Maybe this is normal. Maybe most people have no recollection of the first few years. You'll probably be surprised how strong my recollection is of the years that follow. But I can very distinctly remember my first real memory, like the first thing that I definitely remember happening, and I remember exactly how I felt, and I remember exactly what it looked like. It either had to be my 3rd or 4th birthday, probably 4th. Basically, the way that we ended up in Virginia is that my parents had toured with Lollapalooza. If you've never heard of Lollapalooza, it is currently a one weekend festival that happens in Chicago once a year, I think. But in the 90s, it was a tour created by the lead singer of Jane's Addiction, Perry Farrell, which is a band that my parents were both big fans of circa around when I was born. They kind of connected over being fans of Jane's Addiction at the end of the 80s. So the fact that this was a thing was a big deal to their generation. And even if I don't think they actually got to see the first couple Lollapaloozas because they were having babies around that time and my dad was in the Navy, when my dad stopped being in the Navy, he started working for a skateboard clothing company, a brand called Basic. And apart from that, he would meet people like weird business people, and he met a guy called Pernici who hired my parents to run a stall tour along with Lollapalooza and sell Pernici clothes, but didn't actually give them any setup. So they just had a bunch of tubs, and they would basically create a stand out of the tubs of the clothes and sell the clothes out of the tubs. It is a hippie festival. I've seen footage of myself sitting with the tubs. I know we had a Fisher-Price slide, and I remember going down the slide while Coolio was performing Slide, Slide, Slippity Slide. Fantastic Voyage is the song. He was performing Fantastic Voyage somewhere in the distance. I never actually saw the show. I would just be over at the clothes stand, And I know that at one point, the drummer from Green Day took my brother and I aside to try to teach us how to skip rocks on a pond. And this happened because my dad had just struck up a conversation with them about being from the Bay Area. He's from San Jose originally. So one thing led to another. He gave them some clothes. They, ended up hanging out with us for a little bit. So I remember vaguely skipping rocks with Trey Cool. I remember vaguely being on a Fisher-Price slide at some point during Lollapalooza, but these are memories so old that I cannot imagine that what's in my head actually resembles the reality of what happened. But I have a much clearer memory of what happened to end that second tour, because my parents did this 2 years in a row, and the second year they had like a meth head who was with them, and it created all kinds of drama and problems. The fucking camper kept breaking down, and basically halfway through the tour, when they got to Virginia, my mom is from Virginia. Her family was in Virginia. And so my dad left my mom and I and my younger brother Victor with our aunt and uncle and cousins who were living in Virginia, in Poquoson, I think, at the time, probably Newport News, somewhere around there, somewhere in the northern end of Hampton Roads, in a house that was basically in the middle of fucking nowhere. It was like an acre of property, a tiny house, with like a big amount of land that assumably they planned to do stuff with before they started fighting each other practically to the death, which they were doing when we were there. So my dad had to finish the tour by himself, get all of our stuff into our Geo Metro, and drive it across the country by himself with the mattress on the roof. And he did that over the course of however, like, a couple of weeks that it took to finish the tour and do all that. Shockingly fast. But while we were at my aunt's house, her and her husband were in the process of a very, very violent divorce that we didn't know that this was really going on. But I had a birthday there, and I remember very distinctly that my parents got me this car mat, like this like rollout mat. That was like, imagine, Grand Theft Auto 1, how it's like the top-down city map. It was like that, but like a rollout mat. And it's because I had been playing with cars a lot, like as a young kid. But at this point, I had kind of not really, for a little bit been playing with cars. And also, no one was around to play with me. So I remember we had rolled out this mat out in the backyard, and I had a couple of cars, and my cousin was, he didn't want to come out and play because he was dealing with his parents, fighting and stuff. And like, my mom was, I remember, for whatever reason, I think she was taking care of Victor, so she couldn't come out to play with me at the time. And I was like, man, dad's not around, mom's busy, my cousin's busy, and I'm just like alone on this car mat, and there's ants. I remember the ants start crawling on it, and I remember dissociating. It was the first time that I clearly remember feeling like out of body, like having that sensation of like, I don't know what to do right now. Like, I don't know how to place myself. I feel no sense of purpose because I should want this thing. Like, this should be something that, like, is really exciting. Like, the thought of it was really exciting to me. But as soon as I was alone outside, which I was not really used to being outside either at this point in life, we had always lived in these little apartments, and, again, my cousin's parents had this acre of land, so we had rolled this thing out on the grass, but I wasn't used to seeing like ants and stuff. I was literally not used to being outside at all. So yeah, I was just kind of like scared and alone and unsure what to do, and I froze up and I couldn't move, and I was just kind of watching myself from outside of myself. And that became a more and more normal experience as I grew up. And it's still not something I totally have control over. It's still something that happens to me pretty much daily, of having moments where I just completely exit myself and I feel like I'm viewing my life from outside of myself. And that's why those moments connect, because it feels like I'm always going back to this same place that I'm only in for a few minutes or maybe a few hours at a time, but it's like continuing a narrative that was left off back there, And so it's this feeling like there's one part of my life that's happening in tiny increments over the course of decades, while real time is playing out, and I'm also experiencing that. So those different parts of my consciousness that are trapped in different parts of my life have kind of materialized themselves into different kind of personalities. In a way, the version of me that, was sitting on that mat has grown up a bit, but is still aging slowly compared to the rest of the parts that are experiencing time in real time. Or if I'm bouncing between two personalities that are, both getting like a pretty decent amount of current tense, I feel like there's a part of me that somehow has way outpaced my aging. Like there's a part of me that feels tremendously older than the rest. And it's, I don't know if I feel older than most people my age, being 34 years old. I felt like when I was young, people who were in their 30s seemed really old to me. But what I've come to realize now that I'm in my 30s is that we are simply the least visible people, because being in your 30s isn't, you don't look that different from your 20s usually. I've gone exceptionally gray, but that also happened during my 20s. Like that, it hasn't gotten that much worse to where it would make you think, oh, this person's 40. By the time I'm 40, I'll look 40. I think I am one of the rare people who like definitionally looks 30, looks in my 30s. But not a lot of people really, you look at them and think, oh, 30s. You either think, oh, maybe they're in their late 20s or maybe they're in their early 40s. It's sort of an invisible decade, I think. You don't see a lot of media that's like explicitly about people in their 30s. You know what I mean? And the whole time I've been in my 30s, I've been confused about where I am in them. I always think I'm further. Right now, I feel like I am 37, and I know I am 34. So I don't know where the 37's coming from, why I'm jumping 3 years ahead in my brain. Maybe because that's how old I'll be when I can become president. That's probably what it is. That I feel 37 because I feel like I'm already getting elected president in 2028. And so I have to already be the age I am when that happens. Long shot bets make the biggest payouts, and carry the highest risk factor. So moving forward, just to go through the rest of my life story quickly, because mostly I wanted to just get to that anecdote about the dissociation, but more of this matters. When I was living in Virginia, my family would move all the time, and mostly this was just the result of the fact that my dad was a hustler. He was somebody who was really out there trying to bring the money in. And when they first moved to Virginia, my parents both became managers at like a hippie clothes store called Picasso Moon. And they were each managing different stores, which meant that there was a lot of like, us getting babysat, or they were still like having, kind of lots of parties with friends who do drugs and stuff. They were just very much still a part of the hippie lifestyle up until a point when they realized like they're kind of living in the hood, and there's like people bringing coke around and they got kids in the house, and like basically they had a moment of realizing we cannot keep being like the hippies if we want to take care of these kids. And then especially when my mom got pregnant with a third kid, and that's when it was like, okay, this is over now. And my dad went and joined the car business. Now granted, in the 90s the car business is like the Wolf of Wall Street. Like the stereotype of that type of environment, that's what the car business was in the late 90s. So my dad went from a relatively hippie environment of managing a clothes store to being, you know, coked out and selling cars all the time, and basically became the salesperson of the year every year until he was manager, until he was, moving up through the ranks. And as he did all that, moving into bigger houses, making more and more expenditures, getting into more and more loud arguments about money, having crash outs at the end of every party because they always have to be the people who are up the latest and do the most. You know, that's the cloth I am cut from. So if you do know a lot about me and you're watching this video, maybe you understand some of these tendencies that I've got, because it is all very much familial. So, growing up in that environment, I got used to just suddenly changing everything that's happening in my life, and I was not a talker growing up at all. That started later. So when all these things were happening, I didn't have any idea how to express like how I was feeling or my perspective on what was going on. But until I started school, I remember feeling pretty much like as long as my mom was there, everything was okay, and my mom was always there. I was never separate from her. When I started school, that's when I just entered this realm of confusion where my mind is always racing. Like, I felt like being at school, I required myself to think constantly in order to maintain a sense of comfort, because everything seemed strange and threatening and confusing. I didn't understand why people would say the things they said to me. And really, what it came down to is I expected everybody to have the same goodwill towards me that my mom had, because that's the only frame of reference I had for how other people would act towards me. So my expectation of other people is that they're going to love me the way my mom loves me, and that's just not true, or so like I've constantly found myself just confused why other people were, not treating me really at all. They just weren't really addressing me. Like most places I arrived, I was seen as such an oddball that I just kind of would fade into the background and not really be addressed for most of the time. So I just kind of sat alone with my thoughts and felt like I was in my own world through most of the time that I was in school. This literally from the beginning, like from kindergarten, even like, because we had gone to various daycares and stuff since my parents had jobs, both had jobs when I was a kid. So, I said I was always around my mom. That's not entirely true, but like, I remember even in those circumstances being in that constant state of like, okay, but when's she coming back, and why is nobody else like attuned to. I remember one time I actually, like, when I was 4, like pissing myself, and the people running the daycare were like upset with me. And I remember just being confused, like, why are you upset with me? Like, this is a thing that happens sometimes, right? Like, but you know, I think they were more so upset with the fact that I could not communicate about it at all. And yet, in spite of the fact that I could not really communicate with people, I did really well in school because I had grown up in front of the television with my mom showing me stuff like Sesame Street and Barney, and like I had taught myself how to read and write off of those shows. And so I was just like a little bit more advanced than other kids, especially my age, because I was like the youngest kid in every class I had too. Because my birthday being August 8th, I should have just waited a year and I would have had like a crazy advantage in school. I didn't do that. I thought like, oh, I'm cool. I'm gonna fucking start early, because preschool had told me I was advanced. So I was like, I'm gonna start school right now, and then ended up feeling behind for everything after second grade, basically. But another thing is that there was a house I lived in for like 4 years as a kid, from age 6 to 10, and that's where like I got the most development of like my personality, the most like connection to pop culture, because I had friends who lived in my neighborhood that I knew for multiple years who would watch TRL, and like my mom was always watching MTV and shit, and like VH1 and all this music TV type stuff. So I got a lot more attuned to culture and people around me, and starting to learn a little bit more about communication during this period. But at one point, they decided that they would put me in a gifted school. like the school system, I guess, decided this. Like, they had pulled me aside for the weird, like autism curriculum thing in the second grade. You can look stuff up about that. I don't know what it's called. But then in third grade they sent me to this other school, and I dropped out of it halfway through fourth grade because it was just fucking, it sucked. It was just a shitty fucking place. I was bullied a lot. I didn't know anybody. I didn't really make friends there. I was also in Cub Scouts at the time, and my mom was the den leader, and they had kind of just given her like all of the weirdos and autistic kids, which was, everyone was either dead quiet or was Philip, the kid who grew up to go to prison for 15 years for building a bunch of bombs that he was going to use on his school, getting out, and then getting sent back to prison for child pornography. Yeah. Things didn't go well for Philip. So then I went back to regular school halfway through fourth grade. Still was getting bullied back there, but when I got into fifth grade, I was in a class with like my two best friends who both would come out as gay probably in middle school, and if I had stuck around with them, we would have all gone to this brand new middle school they had just built. And I've thought about, like, this is like the most probably affecting branch in my life's path, where there's one version of my future where we don't move out of this house where we lived for 4 years. My dad was a sales manager, and he just hated his position. Like, they had been pushing everything on him at work, blaming him for shit that wasn't his fault, and he just felt like he was getting pushed around. They had a lot of debt mounting up because he hadn't been paying his taxes. Also, he really wanted to move to Arizona. They had taken a business trip to Arizona, my parents, and he was like determined to move out to Arizona. So my parents really lived in a different world from their children during this period. Like, my mom was pretty dissociated, and she was also taking care of Shade, my youngest brother, born in 97. So, in Virginia. So, like, Shade's always lived in Virginia. He has way more of a consistent sense of self, even though he also moved a lot growing up. He has some of the same friends he had in middle school today, I have nothing even remotely like that in my life, but that could have happened if we had stayed in Virginia at this point with my two best gay friends. We all would have been, I would have transitioned in middle school. I'm certain of it, like, because I would have known these guys, and I probably would have become a dancer just because that's what my friends ended up doing. One became a personal trainer, the other became a dancer, or maybe a singer. Maybe I would have sung along, maybe I would have been a singer with backup dancers. I have no idea. What happened was, one of my mom's sisters, who lives in Florida, was also on financial hard times, and we had this grand idea that we would move in with her. It was her and her two kids, who are about the same age as me and my brothers. So maybe they thought, like, oh, the kids will all get along, and like, which, whatever. I got along with my somewhat older cousin, who is a girl. I'm not gonna say anybody's names. But her son was Evan, my autistic cousin, who set himself on fire last year and died. I've told stories about him, so I'm not going to get into that. But, he was like 8 at the time, and he was just like a kid running around being a little autistic kid, like, I didn't even find him especially annoying at the time, and a lot of other people did, and I didn't really get it. I just saw him as like a kid, but I was also a weird kid, so maybe that's why. In any case, my aunt was the one who was really truly off-putting and strange, and who I had a sense personally did not like me. I remember as a child thinking, this woman doesn't like me, does not care about me, does not have my best interests at heart, like, just absolutely is not a good person in my eyes. They would all also go over to their dad's house, and he was very like, hands off. Like, it seemed like he was trying his hardest to pretend he didn't have kids. I don't know. Um, but yeah, the reality of going down to Florida was that my parents couldn't really find consistent work. My mom ended up tinting windows for like $8.50 an hour, and that was the main income for our 5-person family for a little while. You know, my dad kept shifting between jobs, not really finding something that was working, and our van got repossessed, so we moved back to Virginia, and my dad became a sales manager again. And initially, like, his boss had divorced his wife, but then they got back together, so the house that she had been staying in, we got to stay in for like 6 months. Then we moved again to Newport News instead of Virginia Beach, which is the city we had done all this living in. By the way, Pensacola was where in Florida, and we were there for like 5 months before that all imploded. Maybe not even 5 months. I went to school, very briefly at, like, I started middle school because it starts earlier in Florida. I went to school for like a week or two, and then we moved to Virginia, and I started school again a couple weeks later. So if you couldn't tell, my story, my upbringing is one of constantly losing all connection to what I was doing up until that moment. Like, anything that I cared about or that was relevant to me just went away over and over again, And, like, you know, I would make friends, never see them again. And when I would try to reconnect, like when we moved back to Virginia, I tried to get back in contact with my friends. We didn't go to the same school anymore. And like, everything that was relevant to them was all the social connections they were building at their new school. I didn't understand any of it. I don't know these people, I would tell them, and just lost connection. So when we were living in Newport News, my best friend became my older cousin, the one whose parents had been splitting up when we were, when we first lived with them. And at this point, he being 4 years older than me, I would have been like 12 and he was like 16, and we became friends at the time where we were just huge into anime, huge into video games, huge into the internet, and basically everything I thought was cool was whatever my cousin thought was cool, and on some level there was a lot. He was more into like violence and sexuality and like the creepy, like, demons and stuff, like all that side of anime, and I was more into like the Bishonen big swords, like I want to see Rurouni Kenshin and fucking Inuyasha. So there were some differences in our tastes, but overall, like, I was checking out the kind of stuff my cousin was checking out. But then we moved again, and this time it was out of like, my dad became a born-again Christian, and he didn't want to work in the dirty car industry anymore, so he tried to become an apprentice electrician, but that didn't pay enough. But then he just got kind of talked into working for like a dealership run by Christians upstate, in Chesterfield near Richmond. That fell through because it was really fucking boring. So then we actually moved to inner city Richmond in like a cheap fixer-upper old ancient house that had no central heating. And my dad again became an apprentice electrician, again realized this doesn't pay enough, and I never have enough time to actually fix the house, or will or motivation. This was the period where I really entered like a hard depression. I went through puberty. All of my relationships were through the internet, and we had like the slowest internet connection, and I was just being like catfished by someone through internet forums, and thinking about, that relationship all the time, that non-relationship all the time, writing poetry, being really emo, listening to a lot of Linkin Park and Green Day, specifically, the sad Green Day one, the fucking, what the fuck is it called? The Heart Hand Grenade. American Idiot. And like, started listening to all the weird music that my cousin had downloaded onto my computer, like Tool and shit, and really got into my feelings. This is where I really became like an artist, as no longer as like a fun thing to do, but as a way to get through life, like making like I had been making little magazines and stuff since I was a kid. I would write songs, I would draw magazines, mostly copying stuff out of Nintendo Power and Beckett, Pokemon Collector and stuff. Um, so like I had artistic and writing tendencies even when I was little. Writing for school I always enjoyed. And there was a time when I was in like fourth grade where I used writing to trauma dump. Like every like major trauma I could remember, I wrote a story about it, just a short story. I had even tried to kill myself in the third grade by putting clothespins on my nose and mouth because I was getting bullied. Um, Obviously, that didn't. That was too physically painful to keep a clip on your nose until you suffocate. But what does an 8-year-old know about suicide? Well, I guess it depends on the 8-year-old. Anyway, when I was like 14 is when I really started writing a lot, and that became like a part of my identity. And it was like a period where my parents' relationship wasn't really good, and I felt really disconnected from my brothers, in part because I was starting to realize that I was bisexual, but I didn't feel like I could talk to anybody about it. And when I did try to talk to my mom about it, she kind of was too overbearing, and I didn't really know how to communicate. Again, I was never a talker to this point, so, uh, the only time I would really get into my talking bag is that kind of like autistic thought dumping all at once, where like me and Vic would be like playing air hockey up late at night or something, and I would just ramble for like hours about everything I had thought. Um, but like the whole way that I do this now, I developed really in my late teens and 20s, and mostly through doing this. So during this period when we were living in Richmond, this was when like I was like one of the only white kids at my school, and I really tried to make friends, especially through music, but people did not want to hang out with me because I was just weird. I was weird looking, I was weird acting, I felt out of place, I was dissociated all the time. I did decently in class because it was like the lowest level schooling. I mean, this was a school that had like a 1/3 graduation rate. It was very, very hood. It was a place where you had to tuck in your shirt because they were worried you would have, weapons on you. And, but they didn't care about me. Like there was a point that came where I realized that I didn't have to tuck in my shirt because everyone knew I was not a factor, like, and we lived there for probably like 7 months or so. And then my dad finally was like, I need to start making money again. And like, the funny thing about being really good at your job is that you're always necessary. So like, he always had the ability to just become a sales manager again, and he did. And then after a couple years, it just so happened that one of the general managers died of like a heart attack or something, and so there was an opening, and my dad got to fill that, and he ended up being a general manager for like 10 years. So this 10 years is a period where my dad was making so much money that from the perspective of anybody who I know, my dad is a rich guy. Like people who meet my family, their perspective during this period, which is really when I, made the most friends, when I started to become a bit more personable, and started to also talk on the internet more, and build my presence there. Because even though I'd been online, I'd been on forums and just doing text, like, and it wasn't until my late teens I started really making friends and having people I would talk to regularly online through the anime blogging community. So, like, I kind of built myself through the internet, but mostly in my late teens when I was like really communicating with people who are older and better at writing than me, and were able to, help me progress in how I could express myself. And then some of that I could also translate to real life, and it made me a better communicator in real life because I had learned all these lessons as a writer. I graduated high school in 2009. I tried to go to community college, and at first I was going to art school, with my mom because I was afraid to drive, and my mom wanted to go to school anyways, and we were both, able to align our schedules in such a way that we would have classes on the same day. I would spend a lot of time waiting around while she was in classes, in between, but we would go to school together in her car, which my mom drove a nice car, and my mom was the way cooler one out of the two of us. I dressed like shit. I felt like shit. I was super out of it and dissociated. I'd gained a lot of weight. I had a shitty, scraggly beard. I just looked like fucking shit in college, and nobody talked to me, and I made no friends, made no connections. The only thing I really learned was that I needed to simplify my writing from one teacher who gave me good advice. And I also remember spending a lot of time walking around the campus at the Virginia Beach TCC, which came a little later because the art school is in Portsmouth. And so my mom and I would drive out to Portsmouth, take these art classes, and we did a first semester, and then my dad convinced me to try to take business classes because his dream was to open a family business, but he doesn't know fucking anything about business. So his dream was that his kids would learn about business and we'd be able to open a family business. So I tried to take business classes online, and I fell into the worst pit of depression and inactivity I ever had, and basically crashed out and wrote a letter to my parents about how like I really need psychological help, and rode a bike to the hospital at 2 in the morning in a t-shirt in February, which fucking sucked, and just kind of sat in the lobby of the hospital until my parents ended up coming and getting me. And then I started therapy, eventually ended up on Wellbutrin, took that for like a year, and it basically made me feel comfortable doing nothing. Like, it relieved me of the anxiety of feeling as if there was a way to fail life other than dying. Like, I feel like a lot of people walk around with this weight on their shoulders that like one wrong move and their life's gonna suck from then on. And it's like, no, you're gonna feel exactly the fucking same, regardlessly of your circumstances. And I realized that like through taking that medication and then proceeding to not change anything about my habits and just lose anxiety. Like, it was, oh, okay. I see. Anxiety is not actually related to my circumstances. It's just a thing that happens, because my brain's broken. I can deal with that. I can live with anxiety if it's not actually, like, if it doesn't actually mean anything. When I was in high school, my family actually moved twice, but stayed within the same school zone so that they wouldn't create the circumstance of us losing all of our friends over and over. And in particular for my brother Victor, because he was going, he came through right after me. And then I think Shade also went to the same school also all the way through. So we all went to the same high school for all 4 years, in spite of the fact that we moved twice during the time I was in high school. But most of the friends we had in high school were the same ones that would end up doing some of the early content with me. So when I first started really trying to make art on the internet, a lot of my friends were musicians, so I would try to get them to record stuff. Usually we just improvised stuff, and that was the early trial of the Golden Witch music, was like improv sessions with me and my musician friends. Me just literally trying to get them to record anything, because most of them did not want to. And otherwise, there was a band that some of them were in called the Fridayers that I did a performance with once as the vocalist. But that kind of dissolved when their main guy like left to chase a girl to Vegas or whatever. So like, these high school friends I had, some of them were in some of the early Let's Play content that I did when I was first starting as a Brony YouTuber back in 2013. So like around this time, my parents got into a house like in 2009, right after I graduated. My parents moved into this house on the outskirts of Virginia Beach, near the military base, near the bay, that was like a big ass 1-story house that had all these weird attributes. And at one point, my dad had refurbished the living room to resemble a castle, where there were mural paintings on all the walls, so it looks like a castle. And it was like a crazy, weird, surreal place to live, and I lived there for like 9 years or something like that. And this was where I really built my career, and this is where people really online got to know me, and where I got kind of like famous and popular. And so people developed this image of me as like I exist in that space. Like that who I am is that person from that room, you know? But the reality was I was new to that room. Like I had just gotten there a year and a half before I started making videos, you know? But then I spent so long making videos in that room that it became how I was recognized. But I never thought it was going to be that way forever. You know, first of all, it was a room in my parents' house, you know, regardless that it was like a big ass, interesting, secluded room. I didn't want to live with my parents forever, you know? So, funnily enough, they ended up moving out of that house first, and I moved in other friends. And then my parents ended up moving back into the house. And then they ended up moving to California because my mom found her real father, who she'd never known her whole life. That happened about a decade ago. Then they moved back to Virginia about 2 years ago with Granddad. So, a lot of fucking moving has happened. And in the time since I left that house, I've been everywhere. I've practically lived. I mean, I've lived for more than a couple of months in like 5 different places, but there was a period of a year where my husband and I were doing a traveling job, so we were just simply everywhere. And we've also done a bunch of just big ass cross country trips where we tried to make as many stops along the way as possible. So I haven't felt like I really lived anywhere for like 5 years until now, because I've been living in this house for almost a year, and it's starting to feel like I'm probably going to still be here a year from now, and maybe even a year after that. It's hard to say, but I feel like I am in a place that is at least hard to leave, or hard to justify leaving for the time being. So yeah, I don't know what's gonna happen, because my expectation is always that it's just gonna be poof, poof, you know, something different, something different. Um, but yeah, again, because of the fact that I was kind of discovered during like the most stable period of my life, when things returned to what was for me normal, like a state of constant flux and instability, it became a lot harder to follow for the people who were keeping up with me as an internet creator. And I could go deeper into that whole story because, like I said, I'm presenting this as though you've never heard of me and don't know who I am, but it would take too long. We're already 45 minutes in, and I've basically told you a summarized version of my life story. Chaotic childhood of constant moving, depressive middle stage of, you know, still constantly moving and also just not having any real sense of self or purpose, or you know, what am I trying to do here, basically. Then I had a period of becoming popular, you know, becoming a known figure online in my early 20s, growing and growing to a point where I realized like I have the opportunity now to go on a journey of self-discovery, you know. And when I was 25 was really when I struck out and I said, I'm going to go find myself. I'm going to go find the world. I'm going to go find my people. You know, I'm adventuring. And I spent the next few years adventuring. And now that I'm in a place where I'm settling down, I can really take stock on, like, what have I learned? You know, what has all this adventuring taught me? Because I feel more differently now from when I was 25 than I did between 25 and fucking 5. You know, like I felt like I was the exact same motherfucker up until 25. And then something shifted pretty heavily, but then at 30 it shifted heavily again. You know, and like I feel like I've been the same person since 30, more or less, but that person is like really different from who I was at 25. And I would want nothing to do with the 25-year-old version of me either. But, you know, I'm very happy with the changes, even if, you know, some of it is negative. I'm older. My teeth are worse, you know, like if you can believe it, my teeth are even worse. If any concept has truly defined my life more than anything, it's movement. Movement, obviously. Lots of moving happened. How did this happen? Why did my parents think it was okay to move so much? Well, my mom was normalized to it because her mom had also moved her around all growing up. Now, my mom's mom comes from a small town called Hillsville out in the foothills of the Appalachia in Western Virginia, closer to Charlotte, North Carolina, than to any major city in Virginia, and so way more affected by North Carolina culture. Very much old white money. And because my grandma slept around and got pregnant before she was married, she got exiled. And her husband were sent to Newport News, where they worked in the shipyards. And they had 4 children together. But my grandma had 2 more kids before they were divorced. And each of those with a different man. None of this did she reveal until way, way, way. Well, she never revealed it. My mom found out. My mom did the DNA work. She did the hardcore investigation. My mom was in her 50s when she found her real father, near death, 82 years old, and she's been taking care of him ever since. Man has no memory at this point. His mind is completely mush by now, but he's still kicking, watching his Baywatch. Because of the fact that my grandma's husband left when my mom was like 4, she grew up with a revolving door of men. I don't think my grandma ever remarried. She just had different long-term relationships. She basically was sleeping around, to keep her purse heavy, to take care of these 6 goddamn kids she was saddled with now. And the life experience, the quality of life experience for her kids varied wildly depending on who she was with at any given time. And keep in mind, her oldest kid, though, was, practically raising the younger ones for a lot of this as well. So, highly dysfunctional upbringing my mom had, moving around all the time around Newport News, having all these different men in her life. My mom became an absolute definitional thought. She will tell you so herself. Definitional thought. A criminal, a school skipper. She went to the sort of redemptive school, not quite remedial, but like where if you've been like a problem kid, because she had run away at 16, I think, and yeah, like, she barely made it through school because she was a troubled youth. Not because she was unintelligent. She, started working at 16 and has always had jobs ever since. Always worked real hard to, keep herself afloat. But she also was flippantly sleeping around back then. It was the thing to do, as she would say. And my dad, despite having grown up in San Jose, he had a troubled upbringing in that his real father also left before he has any memories of. His mom had 4 kids, and she was an alcoholic and was just not taking care of them at all when the dad wasn't around, and he eventually just fled to South Africa and left the whole situation. And she ended up remarrying a Christian guy who got them all baptized and, had their last name changed to his. So, my birth last name is not even my dad's birth last name. It's his adoptive dad's last name. And his adoptive dad died when I was like 10 or so. So I barely, can remember that dude at all. But he was the one who really raised my dad. But he also ended up leaving my dad's mom by the time he was in his teens. And when they were around the mom, and she had joint custody, she was not taking care of them. She was locking herself in a bathroom and drinking. God rest her soul. She's also passed now. But, my dad has no real positive memories of his upbringing and doesn't try to think about it or hold on to the memories, really. So, he joined the Navy because he wanted to eat. He literally was like, they will give me free food, I'm joining. So my dad ended up spending ages, I think, 18 through 24 in the Navy. I was born when he was 22 or 23, something like that. And I think he was 22 and my mom was 26 when I was born. And so, she was coming off the heels of some other toxic relationship where the guy had, told her that if she got pregnant, he would take care of it. But then as soon as she did, he made her get an abortion. And so, if she had had that kid, I would not have even been possible. But, she got with my dad not long after that. They ended up moving to California because he was getting stationed there, and they got married so that if they did end up breaking up, the military would still take care of my mom. And they ended up having a kid, not too long after moving to California. And now you've already heard the rest of the story. My perspective on my parents growing up was that they were sort of immutably, obviously correct. Like, it was the only principle I had in life because, like, they weren't religious. They weren't, really around their families. They weren't around their parents, that much. I only really remember, my mom's mom being in my life from the time that we lived in Virginia on, and she was always kind of treated like a bit of a nuisance, She, she was nice in certain ways, but also like really difficult in other ways, just like as a human being, she says lots of things that just make you kind of like, well, you just please don't say that, but, I kind of knew each side of my family when I was a kid, and they were closer when I was a kid. But as I grew up, more and more animosity grew between, different parts of the family as people just fucked up their lives worse and worse going along, relied on one another more and more. And I grew up with a feeling like outside of my immediate family, no one is really my concern and no one is really reliable. Like, I thought my mom was the center of the universe and she's right about everything. Like, whatever my mom says must be correct because it came from my mom. That's the level of respect she, operated on with her kids is, well, mom's right. And my dad, I just implicitly respected as somebody who had always been making an effort to take care of me and therefore always would make an effort to take care of me in perpetuity, and that, like, I would owe it to them to, be capable not only to take care of myself, but in the long term to be able to pay back to them, to be able to take care of them in the end. And I've always had that, sensation. And my brothers, my two younger brothers, I always considered as like my task, like I was told that this was, my mom beseeched me with this duty to be a good older sibling to these children, and I'm going to do that, and I always cared about them. They were always, the people who I was the most concerned with. Now, granted, when I was a kid, I was way more manipulative and mean, especially towards Victor, like, because he was just there all the time, and especially that he had kind of divested me from my mom in my mind, like that I spent a lot more time with her before he was born, and even then, even more before Shade was born, like, or I should say, I spent more time with my mom when Victor was a baby. He wasn't impeding on what we were doing, what me and my mom were doing together, like as he grew up a little bit, it's like, okay, now we're doing stuff with Victor, and also we've got Shade to worry about, and now, like, it kind of, after there was all three of us, it became a lot more that it was just me and Vic doing our own thing, while my mom's taking care of Shade. And then eventually Shade kind of folded in, and it became that all three of us are kind of doing things together, But because he's 6 years younger than me, Vic's only a year and a half younger than me. Like, me and Vic were always a lot closer, and so I kind of treated him like my lackey. He hung around me all the time. So it was like, if you're going to be here, you're going to do stuff for me. But that also kind of fucked up our relationship and made it, because he was a really sensitive person, and he could tell that he's being manipulated, but he also, like, hates that, and so he grew up into sort of his own kind of anxious and depressive teen, but has at this point made himself pretty successful. So I feel like he's probably the person out of the three of us who's had the most, like, obvious growth from who he was as a kid to who he is now as, like, a totally different, vibe. But yeah, when we were in our teens, like, I kind of got sucked into my own world because I was spending all this time on the internet, and the stuff I was into is like reading and writing, and Victor hated doing that stuff. You know, he was big into video games, big into fantasy, and like, you know, his taste was all about like what's going to make me have like the coolest image in my head, and what's going to give me like the most epic imagination and like fantasy I can kind of go away into. And I was always more so trying to find like a social connection. Like, how do I figure out what is separating me from other people and get close to somebody? Like, how do I find someone I can trust the way I trust my family? And a big part of that was also because in my teens was when I started to doubt my family for the first time. You know, where like when my parents started getting close, pretty close to breaking up when I was in my teens. And when I was hearing the accusations they're levying towards each other, I'm like, I mean, you are both kind of fucking, you know, you are both kind of in the wrong about these things, you know? And like, it was the first time I started to feel like, oh, maybe my mom wouldn't always do what's best for her kids, you know, or maybe my dad, you know, has like not taken care of her enough for her to want to be around him, you know, like maybe you actually do deserve this. And like, that's a, you know, a heavy thing for me to suddenly realize, like, oh man, the only people I've really trusted, I don't really trust them either, you know. And then my trust in myself totally dissolved, you know, like because I was just not really getting affirmation anywhere that being the type of person I am is okay, you know, other than in a generic sense from my parents. They were always going to tell me like, hey, you know, you are who you are and that's fine. But at the same time, in the moment to moment level of actually being myself, there's always going to be jokes and criticism and little, you know, digs and stuff that, you know, they might not see it as this is me denying who you are, but that's literally what it is. You know, it's a sense of social coercion towards being a type of person that fits your, you know, comfort and narrative better. And so I got more and more distant and less willing to be honest with anybody, you know, and really, again, this is why writing became so important. And I wasn't even sharing my writing back then, you know, like I was writing to myself, you know. And I think probably the first time I like lost a hard drive, because I think I was 17 when I lost the old hard drive that had all my writing from being 14 and 15 on it. Like anything that hadn't been done pen and paper, which thankfully I wrote way more pen and paper than I did on a computer. But I lost like a pretty good amount of little poems and snippets of stories and stuff from when I was that age. And ever since then, I've released almost everything, because if it's out there, it has a way better chance of surviving than if you have to take care of it. Like if I, you know, all the stuff I have that's still on paper, you know, I have recorded vlogs I haven't released of me going through some of that stuff. But if I never do release that and then that paper goes away, it's gone, you know. So, yeah, preservation, releasing is a great way to be preserved. And getting famous is a great way to be preserved historically. During my teens, I got really into philosophy and psychology. And I, for a long time, thought that what I was experiencing was not especially unique because of the fact that I started finding other, you know, sources that I could connect with. Like, I was so desperate for any connection that if I saw even the slightest sliver of it, it was like, oh my God, you know, it was a big deal. And most of where I really felt connected to was coming from anime. For some reason, Japanese media has always just connected with me more. Something about the presentation of Japanese media, just like nothing from America has ever really connected with me. I think maybe because American media is always trying to sell a fantasy of something that just isn't real. And I maybe because even as a kid, I felt like I had seen so many different places and none of it was what I was seeing on TV, so I just didn't buy into it in that way. Or like I thought it was real, but that it was somewhere else. Like, oh, I just can't relate to this because this is what it's like somewhere that I am not, or this must be what it was like 10 years ago when the writers were kids, but things are different now. And really the reality is more like TV is just fantasy, like it is a joined delusion of a thing, that like a proposed normalcy that we all like fantasize about, but it's not actually real. But I didn't really understand that as a kid, and so there was something about the Japanese media that I feel like it just addresses the artifice of itself more head on. Where like Power Rangers is like you're in a normal place, like a regular town, and then a giant monster shows up, and it's like that's preposterous, but it's like, it feels cool. It's like a cool idea. It's not trying to be real at all, and I feel like American media is like obvious fakery posing as realness, and Japanese stuff is like something real pretending to be incredibly fake, and that's what I like about it. So yeah, like as a kid growing up, like my favorite things were consistently Japanese, whether it be, I mean, Beast Wars is an American show, but it's, descended of Japanese design sensibilities, being that it's from Transformers. But like Power Rangers was a big deal to me even before that, which again was like a U.S. show grafted onto an older Japanese show. And then Pokemon was a huge deal to me. Like all my favorite games were from Japan. I was a huge Nintendo fangirl as a kid. I was, just big into Japanese stuff the whole time, pretty much. And the only Western media that's ever really connected with me is music, and particularly hip hop fusion music. Anything that combines hip hop with something else. And by that, I don't mean that I dislike pure hip hop. I've more so gotten into that now that I'm older, and I've like reverse process gotten into it. But like as a kid, most of the stuff that really hit with me would be stuff like Sublime or Linkin Park or like a 311. I was not like a huge 311 fan, but I remember their the first time I heard those songs, and all of that, like that range really hit with me, between alternative rock, grunge stuff that I was born in 1991, which was the year of grunge explosion, and so all of that stuff was old to me as a kid. Like as a little kid, I was already hearing Pearl Jam and fucking Nirvana from birth, So what was new to me was like Smashing Pumpkins and like the kind of heavier sound that would develop into Linkin Park, into nu metal, and I was huge into nu metal as a 10-year-old. Like that was my world of music. That was how I got big into music, was through nu metal. And then in my teens, being like really dissociative and really having like nothing but time to sit alone with my thoughts, I got deep into prog, but mostly from the prog, like the heavier side of like the Mars Volta and Tool and Coheed and Cambria and these kind of like modern hard rock prog bands that were big in the early 2000s and have kind of gotten even bigger today. In the late 2000s, I got really heavy into like extreme metal, but again on the dissociative end. So stuff like Opeth or Mastodon, in that like that, heavy but kind of fun, like not necessarily like brutal, not violent. I should say like non-violent metal. Metal that's just about like feeling sickly and bad, not really about like doing violence on a person. And I guess the same is true for the hip hop I was into. Is like it was mostly the goofy stuff, like Missy Elliott, Ludacris, Eminem, the stuff that is like funny and has cool music videos. And then later on, the heady stuff like Kendrick Lamar, the really dissociated stuff and weird stuff like Clipping and Death Grips, like heavy shit like Denzel Curry. That was my musical development through my 20s. And so music has always been a huge part of my life, given that it was such a big part of my parents' lives, especially my mom. Again, she was always watching music television. In the early 90s, we were watching sing-along VHS tapes and shit, and like music video VHS compilations of like Red Hot Chili Peppers and Love and Rockets and stuff like that. So like the earliest music I remember seeing is Red Hot Chili Peppers. The earliest stuff I remember like hearing and loving it would be like Black Hole Sun by Soundgarden, or like fucking the Deftones Turn Into a Fly song. Like there were like certain radio hits that would just hit me different even as a little kid, who was mostly listening to like the Power Rangers tape and the Pokemon tape, cassette tapes, back when you had a cassette tape player in your car. And through that whole period where my dad was selling all those cars, he was not really present in our lives because he was working all the time. But he always spoiled us. He made sure that we had the video games we wanted and the Pokemon cards we wanted. But it was weird because my dad was always trying to spoil us, and my mom was always trying to keep him under control. And so we had this weird duality growing up where I felt poor, like, for most of my childhood, like, until my dad became a GM, and then it was ridiculous. Like, he was actually making, like, a lot of fucking money. But, like, as a kid, my mom would act like we couldn't afford to do what my dad was doing. And so from the perspective of kids outside of our house, we were like making all this money and had all this stuff, and there was like a jealousy, but also a level on which we would just get used because they would come over and eat food. Like, people would come over to our house not to hang out, just to eat and leave, because they knew they could walk all over me and my brother, and that and my dad did not care. He was like, hey, if people need to eat, they need to eat, which I love that about him. But my mom was like, we can't really afford to be this way, like, my dad's just doing that because that's what makes him feel good, is like, if he can, give us whatever we want because we asked for it. But my mom was not trying to do that, so again, a strange duality where I always felt like we were broke even when we weren't. And then when we were broke, like, it was like, I could feel it because we couldn't eat anymore. It's like, oh, suddenly there's no food. But it was like a weird feeling of, oh, this is what's actually broke. Like, we weren't really broke. Now we're actually broke, But then we would always come back from it. So I grew up with this feeling that, like, no matter how broke you get, as long as you are good at something, that is in demand, particularly if it's selling cars, then you've always got an in towards just making a whole lot of money again, so, like, my dad kind of basically going from being legitimately broke, like, where, again, when we were in Florida, my mom was the only one with a job and it was $8.50 an hour, like, we were eating peanut butter, like, as the main source of food. Like, when we lived in Richmond, it was, it was not pretty. It was a lot of and like, even then, like, we never really were a home cooked meal kind of a household as much as a TV dinner, and hostess snacks kind of a household. And part of that was, like, my parents were not good at disciplining us as kids. Like, if I were to ask my mom why did we eat so badly growing up, she would say, well, y'all wouldn't eat anything. Yeah, no kid wants to eat anything other than sugar. You make them, but they just didn't have that kind of force of will to discipline us like that. So, it's something I still struggle with to do to myself. Like, I am not good at disciplining myself, and the consequences are dire, and I definitely wish they had done more on that front, but it's way too late now, like, nothing they can do about it now. So sorry, you really missed the boat on the discipline part. But yeah, my dad would just kind of spoil us in a way, but it was in a way that I think he felt more than we did, because he would spoil us in the moment, and it would be something like, maybe my brother starts crying in the store about how he wants Pokemon cards, and my dad buys him like 3 packs, and it's like, well, wait, hold on. There was something I wanted for $15 that I've been thinking about for months that I thought we were too broke, and, because he cried, wait, hold on, it's just, it was so incidental the way he's an emotional spender is what I'm trying to say. And again, he spent way more money than he had during this era. So, if you ever meet somebody and you're really thinking like, damn, they have way more stuff than everyone else in the neighborhood, how are they affording all that? They're not. That chicken will come home to roost one day. So, like I said, I got really into philosophy and psychology when I was in my teens, in part because my dad had gotten really into those things when he was in his 30s, probably late 30s, I guess, when I was in my early teens, right? Does that add up? That makes sense. So he started getting into those kind of like philosophical readings and stuff like that. And I was kind of picking up behind him, and it got me into that stuff. But I got like way more into it, particularly into psychology. And psychology was not at all a popular subject in the 2000s. Like, it just wasn't something anyone was really talking about. Like, it wasn't highly represented in media. It wasn't like, therapy was seen as like kind of weird, and like you have to have a real issue, and I never thought I had a real issue, because I was like, well, everything's cool about my life. What do I have to be depressed about? Like, was kind of my mentality. But after so many years of feeling that way, it was like, well, okay, I've done the research, and the research says I have a chemical problem, and like nothing I can do is going to fix this. So, I need to see a therapist, or else I've given up on self-help, basically, was how I felt when I was 20. And then, talking to the therapist made me realize that I actually did know a lot more than I thought like, it made me feel like, oh, I'm talking to somebody who is confirming that I do know that what I think I know about this subject, And since then, I've talked about psychology on the internet before it was cool to be weird about. Man, JREG really opened a door that I was struggling with. I want to credit this to the 1-2 punch of Jeffrey Epstein's whole thing happening, coming to light, and COVID. Because in both of these situations, there was a level of like disillusionment that I think has never been experienced before, at least in the United States, about like what has really been going on. And for me personally, like, a lot of stuff that I discovered through traveling and through having experiences in my 20s made me realize that like the core institutions at the heart of this country, that we have some level of faith that someone smarter than us is like at the helm of, they're not. Like, and it wouldn't even be feasible, because there's just too much. Like, there's too much industry, there's too many people, there's too many there's too much necessity to match the level of what is providable, like intellectually, to compete in like the modern world. And I think that right now you have a better shot as an individual of like figuring out who you should listen to and why, than you do like relying on institutions to tell you what to do, because none of them know what they're doing. Like, there's not one single institution right now that is set up in a way that would protect you long term, other than the institution of the self. And thankfully, America, for some people, is a place where living selfishly is tenable. But there is a limit, and that limit is getting raised, rather, or lowered. I'm not sure how you would phrase this, because I've broken this analogy by going too far with it. But basically what I'm trying to say is that it used to be more possible to be more independent with less money in America. And it's becoming more and more so that we are having to be interdependent, because of the fact that the cost of living is just going up. And it's becoming harder and harder to be just a totally independent individual. And I think that that's a bad thing in terms of, I would like everyone to be able to do what they want. I do think that there's an opportunity here for us to try to learn how to be better in community, because community is what most people seem to view as their end goal in life, and yet for some reason everyone is convinced they can't do it locally. Like, and this is everywhere. Like, I talk to people in any city, of any walk of life, ask them what their dream is of like their ideal life, and they're always going to say, I want a compound off the grid where it's just me and people I know, self-sustaining. That's not hard to do in America if you can actually get 25 people to agree to do it. But everyone goes looking for that, like, on the internet, and you can't build community, that kind of community, with people you don't know in real life. Like, and it's not that I'm saying that you can't really know a person through the internet. I mean, you can't. You really can't. But, or that, like, that you wouldn't be able to get along when you meet. I'm saying you have to meet before you can get to that next stage, you know? Like, and it might be that the internet is a good place to gather together 25 people, you know, who will want to build a thing together. But it's weird that everyone is convinced they can't just do that with the 25 people closest to them when almost everyone seems to have the same vision. But most people aren't even talking to their neighbors. They don't know who they are because they don't want to roll the dice on it being someone that they wouldn't like, you know, or they've formed a stereotype about who they are based on what they're seeing from the outside. But for the most part, you don't know. And American neighborhoods are insanely huge and dense. Like, even a relatively suburban neighborhood, they're huge, you know? Like, so even if the houses are fairly spaced out, typically there's going to be 5 people living in a house, and there's going to be, you know, the neighborhood goes for miles. So, like, wherever you live in America, there are tons of people around you that you could have a community with. And just statistically speaking, like, it would be, you would have to be a truly anomalous person to not be able to find anybody within like a proximity. But the finding is the hard part. And like, society is not built to make it easier for you to find these types of people, because people who hold power, they have an easier time holding that power if they keep you inside of their paradigm instead of inside of your local paradigm. America, in particular, is not set up to facilitate relationships between neighbors, because most of our neighborhoods are built in such a way that you have to leave the neighborhood to get to your job. And even then, you have to leave that, either one of those areas, to get to anything else: entertainment, food, whatever. You know, like, we have entertainment districts, we have job districts, and we have residential districts. This doesn't make any fucking sense unless you are an oil company. Like, then you would love for everything to be built this way. And because America runs on oil, um, that's what we have as our structure. It does not serve the population. So America's not built in a way for people to group together to form coalition of locality. It's built to make you feel divorced from the place that you are local to. It is built to make you form communities in bespoke spaces that you have to be able to afford. You know, a country club is literally a commune. It's literally just like 26 people pulling their resources together to have a gay little thing they can hang out at and do whatever they want, you know, like, and nobody else is allowed in. Like, what you're fantasizing about is just making a country club, basically, but only rich people can actually afford to do that, you know? And the only way you become rich is by building trust. And you will not build trust with rich people if you are not already a rich person, or you are not ingratiating yourself to them to the most ecstatic degree imaginable, as we see with, you know, anybody who's quote unquote sold their soul for fame. You can do that. Most people don't want to. If you can build trust with a community, then that community can continue to grow and, you know, foster relationships with other communities and build coalitions and federate, and eventually, you know, you've got a government that works for the people. But that requires the people to actually be running their local governments. And most people have no awareness of their local government in the United States. Most people do not know. I personally don't think I can name my local representatives. I don't know the mayor of Norfolk. You know, I live in Norfolk now. I have for almost 2 years now. I had never lived in Norfolk previously, but I don't know who the mayor of Norfolk is. So, you know, I who's sitting here telling you that I'm planning to run for president in 2028 am now realizing I have to go learn who the fucking mayor of Norfolk is, because I don't even know right now, because that is how unpublicized local politics is in America, that even someone like me who's like a little bit tapped in, I don't read the newspaper. I probably would know who the mayor was if I read like the actual newspaper. It's really difficult for me to imagine almost anyone in the United States achieving the goal that they all keep saying of like having a little community with people that they like and care about, because what most Americans are complaining about right now is their lack of independence, their inability to get away from the people that are closest to them, you know? So I understand like the desire to go and find your own people and build your own thing, but I also know that like most people aren't prepared at all to do that. Like it's a total fantasy, and I've seen so many attempts fail. I've been a part of so many failed attempts that I really am like, you guys got to step back and realize this is not the kind of thing you force. It's the kind of thing that you let in. It's the kind of thing that when someone needs you, you decide that that is the person that you're helping, not because you just, you know, chose them because they were the most worthy of your sacrifice or whatever. Like it's, they're there, you know, like you gotta just let things happen, you know, and not try to like if you ideate a fantasy that's unreasonable and you're never making real legitimate steps towards it, you're just being a bad person. Like you're not living in reality. You are not doing the most you could be doing for your actual circumstances. You're putting that off onto a fantasy future that will never happen. You have to live in what is actually happening, which is literally what's going on around you. You know, like I think a lot about the fact that in my neighborhood, people get shot. And I'm like, how do you affect that? Like, how do you convince people to stop shooting each other? That's something that's been on my mind, you know? Like, is there something that is what's missing just activation? Because there's like nothing to do, you know, in this area that I live in. There's fucking nothing recreationally to fucking do, you know? So like, is it just a lack of, you know, having something other than to be in the streets, you know? Like I I want to know what could be done to lessen the shooting here in Norfolk. But like, you know, that's just like a thing I'm thinking about, and it's so far removed from the fantasy of, oh, I want to move me and all my friends into a commune somewhere. Like, that's not going to stop the fucking shooting in this neighborhood. Like, if I leave this neighborhood, people are still getting shot here, you know? Like, so it's not like an altruistic thing to want to disappear from the thing you're currently a part of and you're just not acknowledging it, to go be a part of some other thing that you think theoretically you'd be willing to acknowledge, but like there's no proof. Like what evidence do you have that you would be more associated towards the goals of this commune? Like, do you know what you would actually have to do? Like, do you know what your job would be? Do you have, you know, like a schemata of how many people will be necessary and for what purposes and what are the timetables? You know, like you got to figure out how you're running the thing, and I don't see anybody doing that. I see people fantasizing about the concept of it, you know. I've even met people. I met a guy who was like a woodworker who was like building, you know, all this stuff in his house. And I was like, he was talking about like these kind of communistic ideals. And I was like, well, why don't you start building houses? You know, like you could just go, you could just get some, you could just build some houses. And he was like, oh, well, I don't think I have the blah, blah. I was like, bro, just, you're fucking building stuff. Build a fucking house. What are you talking about? Like, if I even thought slightly that that was something that I would be good at, I would do that right now. You know, I would love to be friends with people who know how to build houses. That's like the most useful skill you can possibly fucking have. You be dropped in the middle of the fucking woods, you know, helicopter drop shipped by your worst enemy, leaves you in the wilderness. What is it? The Kendrick Lamar lyric: "Leave him in the nemesis, leave him in the wilderness with a sworn nemesis. He'll make it." Like, if you can build a house and your sworn nemesis can't, that's how you're gonna live. You're gonna build yourself a whole fort. He's gonna turn up. You got guns you built in the woods, fucking smeltered through lava you dug up in the goddamn mountainside. Like, I don't know why I'm getting lost in this fantasy. I guess what I'm trying to say is that we live in this paradoxical time where people want to live in the most like sensitive, cushy, like agreeable space possible, but they also are fantasizing about like building that from scratch and then getting to live in it. And it's like, well, we already live in a cushioned version of what reality was because somebody built it, 50 years ago. Like, whether you think those people were good or that they did it right, like, they definitely made things easier for us, And the reason we can think about making things even easier is that those people, afforded us that opportunity. But now we are trying to afford the next generation an even higher opportunity. And when we talk about doing that by like absconding from what we're doing and just building a new thing, it's like, well, you're pushing it back another 50 years. You're not going to get to live in that better society. Your kids are going to have to still be, building the building blocks of it. Like, you're talking about a 100-year plan towards someone having a better life. When, again, if we fix the thing we've got, if we make the thing we've got work, then you don't have to go build a new thing. And I think it would be way easier, like it's 1,000 times easier actually, to fix a thing that's already there than to build a new thing. Like think about the difference between, like, if the motor broke in your car, would you rather just get the motor fixed or replaced, or have to replace everything, like buy an entirely new car? Like, there's a pretty big jump in, what you have to track down to make that happen, assuming that you can't just, availably spend that money. So yeah, I think that America is like a bunch of islands, like an archipelago of micronations, that some of them are doing actually really well for themselves. Most of them are not doing that great. And a lot of it comes down to not really wanting to work together or listen to each other, and using the splinter off solution instead of the fix what's at home solution. It's too much flight, too much, change it for the worse, too much, like, building in the anti-human direction, building a country that is better for a few people at the cost of most people. And again, the only way to subvert that is through like the effort of coalition towards fixing it. Like, you have to, if you work for a company that does evil things, you have to be talking about that to the other people who work there, to the efforts of it being fixed, with the threat of you leaving. And if they don't care if you leave, they won't care if you die. They won't care anything. They will never care. If the company doesn't care if you leave or doesn't care about your opinions, you should not be working there. It's bad for you. If those are the only opportunities available to you, you need to start rioting in the streets of your city. You need to make your mayor deathly afraid of the fact that there's nothing for you in his place. You need to be raising attention at town hall. Like, there needs to be word out, because that's a failure on a structural level, and the people responsible are right above you. They're not, it's not Donald Trump's fault you don't have a job. It's your mayor's fault. It's also Donald Trump's fault, but it's your mayor's fault he's electable. It's, and it might not be your mayor. you know, like, but it's somewhere along the line. If things are bad here, you know, if things are bad right where you are, the person who has to answer to that is hopefully lives locally. And if they don't live locally, then you got to track them fucking down. You know, like, you got to make it your life's mission, because things aren't going to get better for you when you wait a month and then a new shitty job opens up that you lose in 6 months, and then you have to wait another month to get another shitty job. That's not going to improve anything for you in the long term. You have to go demand better. I got a little bit of field of the sort of personal narrative I've been grounding this whole thing with. So I'm going to zero back in on that, talk a bit about kind of what politically motivates me and why, but through going back through my personal history a bit. Because one of the things that has been on my mind the most throughout my life is gender politics. And my lens on it was extremely unhealthy for at least the first 20 something years of my life. It got a bit healthier as things went on. And then at some point I crossed a threshold where I truly like started overstanding what I had been, you know, learning all that time. And now my perspective on it, I would describe as progressive, in such a sense that I'm waiting for other people to catch up with me. So I'm going to talk about my perspective on gender politics and how I want my presence in the world to affect this shit going forward. Because I think if there's a place I can be effective and need to be effective, it might be in this field. So, as I established telling my life story, my mom was the main central presence in my life as a kid. My dad was not really around. So, everything that influenced my personality, my tastes, the way that I approached people was all informed by my mom, which, in a sense, would have made me a very effeminate kid. And appearance wise, I was very effeminate because I had long hair and I just looked like a little girl, you know, by most accounts, up until I was like 14. So I was always sort of besieged with this reputation of being effeminate, but at the same time, I did not feel any connection to femininity whatsoever as a child. And a big part of that is that my mom doesn't act like any other woman I've ever met, with the exception of some of the people she grew up with in Newport News. You know, she doesn't really resemble any stereotypes in the media. She is a type of an alternative chick that kind of predates the stereotype that emerged of the alt chick. And that's because my mom got it. Really, she's an industrial chick. And industrial was not a chick scene, you know? Like, she was the type of person who, in the late 80s, you know, hung out with lots of bands, hung out with, like, dated lots of guys in bands. And so she was always around the music scene. And this was during a time when industrial was, you know, the big alt scene. When Nine Inch Nails was first blowing up, my mom got the Trent Reznor fucking mohawk, you know, like, she was, she one time at a Ministry and Revolting Cocks show, a man in a giant penis costume threw my mom over his shoulder on stage. My mom would go to Gwar shows, you know, like, she's like a very alt type person, you know, hanging out in spaces where it's probably only 10% women, you know, and all of those women are crazy. But, you know, they all come from really different types of upbringings. So I was also raised in that environment. I grew up around metal music and, you know, around just heavy music in general. I grew up, you know, listening to rock stations. And Virginia Beach is also like overwhelmingly mostly military people who do mostly listen to hard rock, but like the kids that I grew up around all listen to like teeny bopper shit and were like mostly not allowed to listen to music with swears in it. whereas my parents did not give a fuck and they swore constantly. And my brothers and I, we didn't really understand the technicalities of like formality because my parents are terrible at it. Like my parents are not people who know how to be in a formal environment. They just wouldn't, you know. Um, they would just simply avoid it as much as possible. And my dad is better at being in that kind of environment. My mom just simply would never find herself there, you know. So like I was never given that kind of training on how to be like you know, white bread basically. And for us as kids, our understanding of don't swear was like, you know, don't say fuck, damn, shit, but that didn't stop us from just using substitute words, which like other kids were not allowed to do that. You know, like saying freaking was seen as swearing by like a Christian kid. So like from our perspective, we had that kind of self-righteous argumentativeness of like, well, I'm not swearing, you know, and it's like, you know, it's just missing the point. Like, and that's kind of where we were at growing up, is like not really understanding that our parents were standing opposed to the norm, and that while that might be correct, it's not necessarily the best look or the, like, you know, the easiest way to operate through society. And my dad, he had swallowed, you know, a lot of his, you know, he grew up like a skater kid and then he joined the Navy. There's a big difference between being a skateboarder and being a Navy. You know, there's a big difference between being working for Picasso Moon and working for fucking Volkswagen, you know. So uh, ultimately, you know, he swallowed a lot of that punk rock edge in order to survive. And my mom really wouldn't and really hasn't, you know, even though she still, you know, like lives dependently off of the fact that, you know, that her husband is not doing it. And I shouldn't say that it's totally dependent because my mom has held jobs and stuff like that, but you know, she survived cancer in her 40s. She's, you know, fully taking care of her dad because of the fact that, you know, my dad can afford it. So like there's multiple people dependent on the fact that my dad matured and became a member of society and did not keep being a punk forever, you know. um, but my mom still keeps the spirit alive deep in her heart, even though she is also very much mom core in the sense that she's always been like PTA member. You know, she was a Cub Scout leader. She was always trying to involve herself in stuff going on with the kids, you know, and she has been a photographer who takes pictures for like high school photos and stuff like that. So she's done all kinds of like wholesome jobs, you know, that have nothing to do with being like this heavy metal queen or whatever. But that has never stopped her from still being that, you know. Also, she was like the biggest fucking System of a Down fan in the world from like 2001 until like 2020. She's over them now, but it took a long time. So, with that being who my mom is, my, you know, relationship to womanhood is very different because it never seemed like my mom liked or respected the normal image of women that was out there. You know, and her version of feminism was like a woman can be different from that. A woman doesn't have to be, you know, my mom's main aversion is to stuff like plastic surgery and shit like that. So she would always kind of stereotype it as like, oh, I'm not going to be one of those, you know, manufactured, having to spend all this money on makeup. Because I think her mom had spent a lot of money on cosmetics when she was growing up. And she kind of viewed it like, why is all of the food money going to cosmetics, you know? Um, so you know, my mom has always been very pragmatic. She's always been a practical person, and she doesn't view all of that, like, you know, girly stereotypes as pragmatic. She views that as like a big waste of fucking time, basically. Now, because of the fact that I was accused of being a girl so much growing up, I got angry about it because, in my opinion, like my mom's, you know, a boy didn't have to be a stereotype. A boy didn't have to be into sports. A boy could have long hair. I was the proof because I wasn't into sports and I had long hair, you know? So, like, to me, my existence as a supposed boy negated the idea that I was feminine. And that argument just didn't hold up with people. And I distinctly remember a time where like somebody was like insistent, like, no, you are a girl. You just are a girl. It doesn't matter what you say, you are a girl. And I'm like, I don't know how to argue with that. And that really put me at odds with girls and with femininity, especially because it was, girls who were saying that, girls who, guys were more like, you need to change who you are and be more of a guy. Girls were like, you just are a girl. And I did not think that that was true. And so I found it disagreeable and wouldn't want to be around girls. In retrospect, I feel like if I had just embraced the idea that I was a girl and hung out with girls, I would have gotten along with them because I never got along with boys and I really didn't have friends a lot growing up, because boys were always into not just the sports, but like the roughhousing and the calling each other names and all the just like the weird gooner stuff, especially with adult guys. Like, there's just so much of the maleness that sits weird with me and is off-putting. And so like being around guys has never been like a very comfortable environment. Nonetheless, my friends would mostly end up being guys, but most of them were guys who didn't know they were gay at the time, and would come out later, or were just opportunistically hanging out with me because like it was a better place to be than at their home, and I would let them in. But a lot of the people who I used to hang out with kind of got sick of me over the years, and or I got sick of them. So one way or another, I don't see a lot of people, and there's some people I think I would get along with, but we just simply live in different strides of life and have no reason to think we'd ever collide again. But like, I I don't feel as though, you know, my friendships during this period were built out of like really understanding myself or like what would make sense for me in a social environment. It was more like I was an outcast, and so I hung out with other outcasts. And the funny thing about two people who are outcasts is that no two of them are really that similar. Like if you grow up part of a group, you're similar to the people in that group and nobody else, but you feel secure in that similarity you have to the people in that group. But if you're not really similar to anybody, and your only similarity to the other people is that lack of similarity, it doesn't make them easier to get along with. And so a lot of outsider groups, they kind of fall apart when people realize, oh, like, well, I do have very particular things I care about and you don't. And like, you know, it becomes like irreconcilable to some people, and they just kind of become an island unto themselves. Or if they can bring someone onto it who is willing to kind of fit themselves into their paradigm, maybe they'll be able to find companionship. But for a lot of us, it's more about like, can I swim back to shore? Like, I've been stranded out here. Can I find a group that I can become enough like that, I still feel like myself, but I also am now, capable of fitting in here, because being on your own kind of sucks. Having said that, I'm pretty normalized to the experience of being alone, to the point where that is now more so my natural comfort zone. And for a long time, it was more of a discomfort zone because I basically didn't trust myself to think I was ever going to have the ability to connect with other people. Like, I thought for a long time, like, I'm stuck out here and I'm throwing messages to the shore like, help, somebody please help, and people are coming out to help me and then deciding not to, and like driving back. I like, it felt like I was just on this endless swim, to the banks of an island. And then I feel like I finally started landing on little islands and finding myself in different places. And each time I got somewhere, I was like, oh, maybe land's not that great. Like, I kind of got used to being in the, like, I've built up some arm strength. Like, I could swim pretty deep. Maybe I'll just swim between islands. Like, maybe that'll be my thing, is I just swim between islands or something. And maybe there's an island out there that I will enjoy being on and I'll want to stay there, but maybe not. Maybe it's a Luffy style life of island hopping One Piece for the rest of time. So I really took on more of the identity of like an adventurer, especially in the realization that like, where would I go back to? Like, Hampton Roads feels like home to me more now than it did when I was growing up, because I keep ending up back here and I know it way better now as an adult. But I think I could easily move to a new city, spend 2 years there, and feel exactly as attached to it as I do to here. You know, like when I go somewhere now, I learn the fucking place. I walk around town, I look at the maps, you know, I find out what's around. I go to all the restaurants that seem interesting, like if I could afford them, you know. I try to really know a place. I go to every park. I've been everywhere in fucking Hampton Roads at this point. This was not true 2 years ago, you know, but like now that I am back living here, I want to know it. But I also know a bunch of other places now, you know, because like I said, I lived a bunch of places, I explored a bunch of places, and that is now more so my mentality is like, how much can I fit inside my head? How many islands can I visit? How much culture can I, you know, digest? And can it lead to like a bigger vision for the broad scope of things? Like, can gaining as much perspective as humanly possible lead to a capability to lead, you know, humanity towards something that they weren't seeing? You know, you just simply didn't have as much perspective as I did, so you wouldn't have seen it. But I'm out here with the eye. I've realized that I have no idea how this computer thinks it is getting audio from this microphone. It says it is, but I've realized the microphone's not plugged in. So you cannot possibly be getting. Is the computer recording from the phone? Can it do that? What the fuck? Hold on. Every time I record a really lengthy vlog, I run into a couple of hiccups inevitably that make me stop and really consider dumping the project. And I've done a few things similar to this video that I've just dumped at about this point. But I'm determined to push through because it's a new year and I gotta fucking get this shit out and off my chest, or I'm gonna end up making the same fucking video again in 2 months anyways. I'm just pretending to use this microphone now. This is just camera audio. I'm sure you knew that a fucking hour ago. I've decided that in 2026, I'm really going to start laying in on habits that annoy me from people that I like otherwise. And one of those is complaining about people who bring up the weather or like who make small talk in chit chat. And there's this like, I don't know why. I don't know what it is about complaining about it that seems cool to people, or like why you think you're above the small talk, or what, like, why do people decide, instead of figuring out how to make it interesting for themselves, decide to complain about it and act like it's a fault of the other person that they, I don't know, haven't figured out what you're into to give you a different conversation topic. Like, the point of saying something like, "Who sure is cold outside," is basically saying, like, you're human too, right? That is the point of that. Hey, fellow human, you're trustworthy and normal. You think like a person does, don't you? And if you respond to that with, ugh, I can't believe this person's talking to me, then no, you don't behave like a person does. You have failed the human test. And like, it's crazy to me that people don't see it at all. Like, because it's so persistent. Like, it's coming to you from everywhere. Like, you just think everyone's an idiot and like there's like everyone's just doing it for no reason. Like, so I want to give you some perspective on this. First of all, consider human evolution. You are a person, you believe in science, I hope. Let's talk about science. Humans evolved in Africa in a very specific environment where it was possible to live outside without even having fur all over your fucking body. We devolved how much hair was on our body. Like we evolved to have less hair compared to monkeys because the environment was so good for humans. There's not a lot of places on Earth like that, and they're not that big. So when humans got really successful as a species and we started occupying a lot of that space, we could not reconcile differences with one another within that space, such as to organize it. Like we could not keep it to a maintenance level. Some people had to go. And if you didn't want to get killed by someone, you were probably going to flee. And so humanity spread, and it spread this way the whole time. Vinland Saga, that anime, is the perfect expression of how human movement happens. Trying not to be enslaved, so you fled north. And then the people from the south got strong enough to come up and try to enslave you anyways. And if you're not strong enough by the time they get there, you're going to be enslaved. And those empires keep moving around the world until they get too big to maintain themselves. Something builds somewhere that can fight back, like in America to Europe, you know. And that's basically the way that human movement just keeps happening. So, theoretically, there was once a time when being a human was like pretty chill because like evolution happened to make us like this. And then ever since then, it's been like these desperation throes, right? Like in order to survive the environments we live in, we have to destroy those environments and repurpose them. If you want to live in a place that's too cold to be outside at night for most of the year, or even during the day for most of the year, you have to kill the trees and clear a space and build a safe space. You know, you have to make sure there's not any animals that are gonna, you know, destroy you in your nearby area. There are no threatening animals in the United States left almost anywhere. There's like maybe a couple of dangerous bears in a couple of parks. But for the most part, you know, like it's you have to go fuck with a buffalo somewhere to like get yourself in trouble, or a bison. You have to really be like acting a fool with a moose to get yourself in trouble with an animal. But like all of the really dangerous ones, we wiped them out. We killed all the grizzly bears because the grizzly bears were the biggest impediment to traveling across the country before we had the artillery to deal with them. So we killed all them motherfuckers in the United States. There are plenty of species we hunted to extinction or to near extinction, or that we only keep around for the fact of them being livestock. One of the most plentiful animals in America is the cow. The cow takes up a lot of space. The cow would not naturally have the numbers it has now if humans were not overproducing them and overcrowding them and basically creating pretty similar conditions for cows as what humans have. There's like a 10% elite cows who get treated really well, and there's a 90% cows that live on a dairy farm packed in like sardines. Chickens though, I don't know that there's a, oh, I guess there are some free range chickens and shit. Most of them though, they go right into the grinder. So surviving in climates like North America has only been possible through violence and then through an attempt to like curb back and focus on maintenance. Like that's where we're at now, is like, okay, we did all the necessary violence to have this place tamed for human, you know, life. How do we now make it sustainable for human life? And, you know, is it even possible? And what's it going to take? And everybody's got their own disagreements about it. And of course, this leads to this mentality that people have of, I'm just going to fuck off and make a commune. you don't even know where there is wilderness in the United States, which, by the way, there's not a lot. Like, most of it's farmland. You just don't know where. How, Ye? How, Sway? Ye tried to do it in Wyoming and he failed. In case you don't know, Ye did try to do that. And he failed. And he had billions of dollars to do it with. And he failed. And he's legitimately a genius. But he's also insane. So he failed. And guess what? You're also insane and you're not even a genius. So what the fuck are you gonna do? The reason it bothers me so much, specifically when people complain about comments about the weather, is that the weather is the most interesting thing in the world. Like, it is the most affecting thing happening at any given time in anybody's life. Because, again, humans come from a place where there wasn't weather to speak of in the sense of, oh, now I have to change clothes. We weren't wearing clothes. We didn't need clothes where we came from. We had to start killing things and turning them into clothes to deal with weather. And there were places where sometimes it's pleasant to be outside and sometimes you need to be wearing those clothes. And you need someone who can predict what's coming, or you need to be able to keep track of the weather. Keeping track of the weather is the most important thing that humans have ever done. It's the only reason we got out of it's the only reason that we have spread over the entire planet, is that we're paying attention to the weather enough to not get annihilated by it, and we are literally living in Antarctica. We have people living in conditions where you can't go outside without being, dressed in like specialized gear that didn't exist 100 years ago. Like, we have truly reached an unreasonable level of dealing with the weather. And so, yeah, talking about the weather is always going to be relevant. It's literally determining what you are doing today. You are not going to the park if it's raining. You are not going... You might not go outside at all if it's raining. You might not be willing to drive if it's going to snow. If it's really cold, it affects what you're wearing. It could be that somebody sees that you're wearing a t-shirt and they're thinking it's cold and they're like, oh, isn't it cold? You're wearing a t-shirt. And you might be like, I'm from fucking Minnesota. I don't feel cold that way. And now, wow, now you understand each other. Like, now this person doesn't have to be like, what the fuck, is this a human being? Is this an alien? What is happening? I've never seen a person in this cold without a jacket. Oh, they're from a colder place than me. Now it all makes sense. Like, again, it's just like a humanness check. For most of human history, encountering an unfamiliar human was taken as a life or death scenario every single time. You knew every human you had ever encountered. Humans evolved in groups. We stayed in groups. Groups that are nearby to each other would know about other groups. Like, if you saw someone who's not from your group, you'd be like, where the fuck did they come from? How is this possible? Are they a renegade who ran off at some point and, because they were unwanted and now they've come back and, why does this person exist? How does this person exist? How could there be a person I've never met, And so there's up until this century, this was the relationship you would have had with an unfamiliar person. But within there have come points throughout history where cities have grown to a level where you certainly wouldn't know the people who aren't on your block. But I don't think really until the last 100 years did we reach this level of density and also this level of disconnect between different sectors of the public, that people legitimately don't know who lives next to them. People don't know anyone in their whole apartment building that has hundreds of people in it. People don't know anyone nearby. You don't anyone in your neighborhood for miles. Your next friend lives 600 miles away. that's the way things are for people now, and it's like that just wasn't even possible through most of history. And I don't think it's good. Like, I don't think it's doing good things for us to be in community at such a ridiculous distance that it's not really functional towards making your life better. Like, it feels like you're putting a band-aid on a gaping wound. I think the biggest thing that we're missing right now as a population is trust in one another, and like, it just like having a coalition of trust at all. Like, if you don't have something that you would describe as a coalition of trust, that should be your first priority in life to develop. And it's something that I've been deeply concerned about in recent years, and it's been a fucking struggle. And it's interesting, I've been watching JREG, who I feel like is a parallel content creator to myself in many ways, because I feel like what I decided I wanted to try to do circa like 2018, he figured out how to actually do. And like, he has been living like the version of my dream from back then that is no longer my dream. And it's fascinating to see, because he basically created a studio and he surrounded himself with all these creatives and he's built this community. And as he describes the difficulties of it, I'm like, yeah, I get it. I know exactly what's happening to you right now, but like, at the same time, I admire it. I admire that somebody actually is doing it, and like, you know, like I don't feel like I could because of the exact differences between me and him that made me go, "Oh yeah, I want something different from this. I'm not trying to build a studio because I don't like necessarily having the community that I'm in be dependent upon the idea that me and the people around me make art together. Like, I would prefer that that is incidental or like non central to my personal relationships, because I don't like everything about my personal relationships being public. And that inevitably happens when you develop a relationship through public presentation. Like, I had a group of people that I did a podcast with where most of the time that I had spent talking to them was on podcasts. And so when I started meeting them in person, like, you start to realize that it's not as easy to necessarily get along in like a spatial way when you're not being like the podcast person. And so it came to be that a lot of people I met in my 20s, like, when I would meet with them, all we would do is record. Like, we would be so uncomfortable with the actual interpersonal, interspatial relationships that we just did nothing but make stuff all the time. And like, you know when anything really gets in the way of the flow of what any of you is trying to do because of one another, it immediately puts a distance in that. As soon as you're like, I'm trying to work on my own project, I don't really care about this thing if it's going to be difficult, it goes away. And so most of those relationships kind of just dissolved in the sense that if we're not doing a project together, we have nothing to do with one another. Whereas I have friends now that I might do stuff with, but my ambition is not that we are to, we're all gonna meet and we're gonna make a club and we're all gonna fucking make art together, because I've seen how if you build your relationship on that, it becomes dependent on that, and then if you want to do anything else with your life, that relationship's gone. And I think that when it comes to community goes a lot deeper than like making shit together or being in the same market or the same field or whatever. It's like, who do you have an actual connection with because they live similarly to you? There are people around you who eat at all the same places you eat at, who shop at all the same places you shop, who are essentially living a parallel version of your life, who have all the same shit in their house, you know and you don't know about them, because the ability for us to meet up and to know each other again, it's being attacked all the time. Like, there is a constant pressure from higher powers that control advertising to convince you, and advertising, I mean everything you see on YouTube, including this. I'm just an independent advertiser. I happen to not work for anybody. I have a much harder job than anyone else in the fucking world of advertising, which is why I don't make the big money. But nonetheless, this is an ad job, and what I am advertising to you is lifestyle changes that will make you more amenable to me as a human race. Uh, and also stuff that will make my presidency really kick ass. Like, I'm setting up the groundwork now so that everybody will remember my presidency as super sick. I've kind of decided that my bit is basically like training autistic people how to fit into society, because there's no changing society to our standard. There's too few of us. We are not a voter base. Like, the big money is not going to follow us. We just have to figure out how do we participate, and we can slowly change it from the inside. But there's a level where we have to boost recognition, and we have to normalize ourselves to society if we want to make it, because it's just not, they're not gonna give us anything. Like, there's not enough of us to demand enough for them to give us anything. I was talking earlier about my complicated relationship to gender, and like, in a in a sense, like a legal sense, like, what do I want to see happen, right? I think that we need an acknowledgement of the fact that gender is a social construct that cannot be locked down in such a way that you can really litigate on the basis of it. Like, you can't litigate people's behavior on the basis of gender because it's too cloudy what it means to be one or the other. Where, like I said, when I was growing up, I was getting like stopped in the men's room and told, like, hey, aren't you in the wrong bathroom, because I look like a little girl. And I'm like, no, if I go in there, it's going to be a different problem, right? So, like, there are people who are going to look at it like, well, why don't you just cut your hair and go into the men's room? And it's like, even if that would have made sense, it never would have occurred to me. Like, and so I don't think that building society around the expectation that people are going to, like, get in line makes sense. You look at what's happening and you build society around what's happening. If there's people who don't belong in either bathroom, make sure there's a third fucking bathroom, And for me personally, now as a trans person, I will always use the third option if it's there. If there's a gender neutral, if there's a family bathroom, if there's a distinct bathroom, I'm picking the distinct bathroom. Otherwise, I'm going in whichever one I look like I belong in. If I happen to be dressed really feminine, I'm going in the women's room. But I don't always dress really feminine, and I look a lot more masculine as an adult. As a kid, I passed so well, I wasn't trying to. Once I turned 14, I went through a massive growth spurt. Became normal height. I'm 5'8.5". I grew up way short up until that point. So I went through a big growth spurt and started growing facial hair, and I was literally afraid of shaving. Like, I hated having facial hair the whole time, but I was just terrified of the idea of putting a razor against my face. And also I was afraid of asking my dad to teach me how to shave, because I was just kind of afraid of really engaging with my parents during this part of my life. So, like, I didn't want to have to explain why I wanted to shave or something. I don't know. So, I just ended up with shitty facial hair through, like, most of high school. I kind of got fat, and I stayed, that way pretty much up until, like, age 28, and then that was when I really realized that I had spent pretty much from, half of my life, like, just hating the way I look, because I had felt like I was always going to be the person I was as a kid. Like, I never thought I was going to grow up into a masculine man. I thought I was always going to be short, always have long hair, always be skinny, always be called a girl, and always be arguing that I was a boy.
You know, I thought I was gonna look like Inuyasha when I got old. Like I legitimately thought that's what I'll look like when I am old because he has gray hair. You know, so like or Rurouni Kenshin. You know, like a short, effeminate dude. That's who I thought I'd be when I was 28. So like, and kind of that's true, but like, it was, you know, like I spent a long time running from the idea that I would be a woman because after going through puberty and realizing that I hated looking like a man, I thought of it as like a pervert thing, you know, because I also became sexually activated at that time. Like I had never thought about sex practically fucking at all, you know, but then suddenly it's at the forefront of my mind and I'm having these bisexual feelings and I'm having these feelings of like hating my masculinity and wishing I was a girl, you know, wishing I was more effeminate, but feeling like if I displayed that, then I'd be accused of being like a weirdo or something. And so I just kind of buried all of this. And the only place that it really emerged was through my relationship with anime, where I was getting more and more into shows about young girls, you know, more and more about girls my age, but like at the time I was 16, you know. So I was watching these shows that were about the experience I thought I should be having. You know, essentially, like, oh, these are the relationships that I wish I had in real life. Was like the relationships in Lucky Star and Hidamari Sketch, and in a way, I did build those kind of relationships with some of my friends who were also fans of those shows. But I think because we all were sharing in that kind of body dysmorphia, we were all in this feeling of like, well, it doesn't mean the same thing, you know, to be like a bunch of guys watching a show about a bunch of girls as it would be to be a bunch of girls, you know, in that situation. And I really think that, you know, the transgender movement that to me really took off in the early 2010s Tumblr culture, like showed people like me, hey, you know, you could have just like dressed as girls and been, you know, and it would have been the same exact experience, you know, like there was nothing that meaningfully different other than our body image. And also the fact that like for me, I always projected Yuri onto everything I watched, but I also didn't really watch shows where the girls were very like feminine, you know, like I wasn't watching shows with sexy girls. I was watching shows with girls who looked like they could be boys, you know. So like again, I don't think the relationships in these shows were actually that different from my relationships, even with the undercurrent gay tinge that, you know, I just wasn't willing to admit, you know, that I was gay for my friends, you know, like even if it was kind of evident in my behavior, it just to my mind, as long as you don't cross certain lines, it's not gay, you know, very southern thinking. So I really got absorbed in like the culture of being into anime girl shows, and I ended up covering my whole walls with anime girl posters and everything. This is when I was like 18, you know. And so I think people started to look at me as like, oh, well, I guess you're like a gooner, you know. I guess you're like just really into anime girls. That was pretty much true, you know, but it was as an escapism thing from my physical dysphoria. Like I felt disgusting, but I would fantasize about Yuri, you know, and like goon and think about something that has nothing to do with my real life, you know, and so during my 20s, you know, I was very focused on like pornography and sexual content, but I was also really ashamed of it. So it wasn't something I was really sharing with people other than my first couple of relationships, you know. And my second really long-term relationship was with someone who was like an even bigger gooner than me. And so our relationship was heavily sexually involved and heavily documented because we were talking about it online all the time. So that really changed that side of how I presented myself online. And interestingly, I kind of shifted back after that relationship because I didn't really like how that went. You know, like I think that I was unprepared to share, you know, like my sexuality with the internet or really even understood it yet at the time, especially because this was pre-transition and pre being openly bisexual, you know. So after those things happened, I felt like I matured a lot and like my takes are very different on like I'm not as apologetic towards pornography as I used to be just in general. Like I think it is something that should be handled really responsibly. And my take used to be kind of do whatever you want, man. You got to express yourself. The feelings got to come out somehow. And like now I'm looking at it like, well, you know, maybe you should judge your own feelings. Like maybe you should try to keep yourself out of certain feelings. And I work really hard to do that, you know. So I know it's possible. So I do think we need to hold people more to task about like the type of content they create, you know. And we see this happening right now in hip hop, right? Like there's this great divide going on where you know, Kendrick basically said like, "Hey Drake, you rap about nothing and you're a pedophile, and like I'm a real person." You know, and everybody went, "Oh, real person? That actually sounds kind of sick." You know, like what if we celebrated real people? And I think that's a growing trend of like people are not trying to be the most famous person in the world so that they can touch the most children. They're trying to be like a human being who like is a pillar of their community and helps, you know, everyone else around them by leading and being growth oriented and focused on mental health above all else. Because it all starts in here. Like you can't make your environment improved until you know your brain is part of the environment. This is the thing you have the most control over in your environment is the inner workings of your own mind. And so if you feel like your mind is not under your control, getting your mind under your control is the first step. How do you do that? Google that shit, dog. Literally get on YouTube. How do I get my mind under control? Like, you know, watch as much information as is necessary until you feel like you've got it. Follow all the threads, go down all the rabbit holes. This is your mission. You can't continue on until you get that under control. So once you feel like you've got a decent handle on your thinking, it doesn't mean that you have to be like your life is good now. It's just that you have a handle enough on your thinking that you feel like when you go into conversations with other people, you are not going to disappear into your thoughts. You have enough of a handle on your thinking that you will be able to maintain presence through the interaction. Now I'm not saying that this means you have to be able to, you know, handle everything all the time. You know, pick your battles. Choose the right conversation partners. Pick easy stuff at first. Work your way up. But like if you literally can't handle a conversation about something you enjoy talking about without dissociating, stop having conversations and figure your mind out first. Go see a therapist if you have to. If you can't afford it, you have YouTube. You're watching this video. Watch videos about how to get your shit under control. If you don't think you can do it after watching hundreds of hours of videos, come to me. I'll be your guardian angel. Movement is so definitional to my life that I really think when I break down what excites me about all of my favorite things, it is always about movement. Animation is about the study and reproduction of movement, something that I didn't really understand fully until watching Keep Your Hands Off the Eizouken, and particularly the episode about the animator's perspective made me realize like, oh, this is about kind of being obsessed with how things move and the timing of motion in particular, which is also what music is about. Music is about moving the particles in the air with specific timing, like making the movement do specific things at specific times. And that's also something I didn't totally understand until getting deeper and deeper into music production and really understanding that how music happens is the interaction between the you know the output and the space. Like it's not just like thing make noise. It's like thing send reverberation that bounce off of the walls, and both of those things make noise, you know, like you're hearing both things. And so like you have to be able to account for many different circumstances as a producer in order to make something that will sound, you know, that will account for many different ways that a thing will be played. And the more you understand that, the broader you are able to make your scope as a producer in terms of who you can reach. And of course, because I myself moved so much and got so used to the idea of just changing location all the time. Um, you know, I was mostly afraid of the outdoors because everything was always unfamiliar to me up until my 20s when I really started driving a lot. And when my husband and I met, he taught me about camping because when I was growing up in the Cub Scouts, the experiences I had camping were like being out in the woods for a week, and just totally dissociating from pretty much the whole thing, having no idea how to do anything, you know. Um, and I didn't really understand that most camping in America is car camping, which is where you park your car in a parking spot next to like a clearing, and then you set up a tent in that clearing and your car is right there. And like in my mind, camping had always been that like you drive out somewhere and then you like backpack with all your shit into the woods, you know, like, and then you have to just be out there in some location. Like I didn't realize that camping was mostly like people in RVs, you know. So when Bird taught me about what modern camping really is, then I started getting really into figuring out where can I camp, where can we go, what can we see. And we started going to parks all the time, national parks in particular. Knocking off every national park is like one of his main life goals. So we've been trying to make that happen. We visit lots of state parks, just do random camping trips. You know, we've camped in all kinds of weather, all kinds of places across the United States at this point. And when we had our traveling job, I was also studying maps. I have an atlas, you know, of the United States roads that I studied pretty extensively while we were traveling. So I have a pretty good sense of where things are in the US. And branching off from that, in more recent times, I've gotten kind of obsessed with Google Earth, just studying the globe. I watch lots of, you know, geography videos, videos about travel to other countries, learning about geopolitics, just anything that gives me a sense of where people are and where they're going and why. Why are people moving? That is the biggest question on my mind. What moves people? What moves people? That's all I've been trying to figure out my whole career. What moves people emotionally? What moves people physically? What moves people to the next stage of their life? If it moves you, I want to know about it. So, yeah, I guess I would describe myself as somebody who studies movement in very general terms. And I feel like understanding movement has given me a level of perspective that I can't find anybody the fuck else who has. Because most people don't really understand the lay of the land. Like, literally, the lay of the land. Like, if you understand why people are where they are, that is foundational to understanding the culture of any place. Most people live on bays. Like, overwhelmingly, most people live on bays. Did you know that? Did you think about it? Is it just something that has ever really crossed your mind? Like, that the overwhelming majority of humanity is just situated on a bay, and if it's not on a bay, it's definitely on a river. If there ain't no bay, there better be a pretty fucking big river. If your town is on a creek, that is a how did they do that? You know, Las Vegas, they had to build a whole dam to make that possible. LA, they had to destroy an entire ecosystem to make that possible. Um, there's a lot of really massive projects. If you don't know about the Salton Sea, look into that sometime. That shit's crazy. They built an inland sea and then made it toxic. Believe it or not, we're going to jump back into my personal narrative for a little bit here because I haven't really addressed my history as a rapper yet. Because rapping is something that growing up was basically a way for me to dissociate and have something to like be doing instead of, you know, being anxious about whatever's happening in school or walking home from school or whatever. I was just always anxious as a kid, basically. So I always had a running train of thought trying to keep myself sane and abreast of circumstance and, and logic through everything going on. And a lot of the time it would just occupy itself by repeating rap verses, particularly Eminem stuff from the late 90s, early 2000s, you know, really just lots of fun little hits that stuck out to me from over the years. Like, I had never really pursued listening to rap because it just wasn't something my family was into, and I mostly listened to music with my family. But at the same time, System of a Down had collaborated a lot with rappers and had a lot of associations in that field. And my mom had all these burned CDs of like random System of a Down, B-sides and shit. So I learned a certain amount of hip hop from that, and then also just from TRL, being on the bus, like listening to hip hop channels on the way to school and shit like that, and knowing other people who are into it, listening to Gorillaz, getting really into them, in early high school, and like all my friends were able to like Gorillaz. No matter who I played that for, they were always going to be okay with it. So anime also played a big role with like Samurai Champloo and I feel like there's a few other anime that had raps in them that I would, all of these I just naturally learned because I thought they were dope. So, like, at some point when I was like 19, I discovered all these crossovers where like people were, taking rap songs and putting them over anime songs. I fell in love with all those, learned all those songs. So I was used to performing rap through singing other people's raps. But as a songwriter, I had mostly written, like prospective new, well, when I go back through old songs I wrote as a teenager, it seems like my biggest influences were Incubus, Coheed and Cambria, Bad Acid Trip, and like Tool and System of a Down and Green Day, and of course Linkin Park. But I was never trying to pull directly from Linkin Park because I felt like that would be too obvious or something. So I didn't really write a lot of raps until I was in my like early 20s, and basically I loved singing and rapping, but I got way more compliments for rapping. Like, people would tell me that I could rap or that they were impressed when they heard me rap other people's songs as compared to singing. So I kind of started leaning in on that. And then I also had friends who were getting really into rap and started writing their own stuff. And one of my friends, Brando, had written a few songs that he didn't know how to perform. So I had performed his songs on our BC mixtape, and like, so I wrote a few of my own on top of performing some of his, and that was where I first started writing my own raps, like intentionally, as like, oh, I'm rapping now, was on BC. You could even hear, if you go through the old Trial of the Golden Witch, that's the first like rap it's the first rap album in the discography. The other shit's like weird improv folk and like nonsense, just experimental nonsense. So, and not to say that BC isn't also experimental nonsense or that I co-sign anything said on that record. Um, but going forward from that, I started writing more raps. And initially, I definitely had a level of Dunning-Kruger effect of like thinking that because I was capable of performing high-level raps, that therefore I should be capable of writing high-level raps. And I feel like a lot of my early music is dealing with this frustration of feeling like I'm supposed to be better than I seem to be, and kind of concluding that I just don't have enough experience to draw from to be better. And so as time went on, I would discover more rap and discover more people who are at a higher level and kind of notice, okay, like, well, I'm actually nowhere close to being as good as like Bus Driver in terms of complexity, or Kendrick Lamar in terms of messaging, or Denzel Curry in terms of flow and, rhyme schemes. And like, these are the people I was listening to at the time who like actually impressed me. It's just that a lot of the mainstream stuff fucking sucked. Like, I definitely thought, well, I could easily outdo fucking, I don't want to say Drake because back then I didn't even really have an awareness of him. But like, just a lot of what I was hearing out of mainstream rap, especially in the SoundCloud era, I felt like I could outdo a lot of those guys. And so my feeling of I'm trying to show up all these SoundCloud rappers was definitely coming through. But I also felt like by that point, I was already in my early 20s and I was like significantly older than most of those SoundCloud rappers that was blowing up. So I didn't want to like come at any of them directly in that way because I didn't want to seem like, oh, I'm, trying to bully younger people or whatever. Um, ultimately I fall into that J. Cole middle child kind of generation of like, people who were kind of a little too old to be meme rappers, but a little too young to be, 2000s era, like, direct descendants of a Lil Wayne blog era. I come from the blog era, but I wasn't into hip hop during the height of the hip hop blog era. Like, I was into anime. I was running an anime blog. I was a part of the blog era, but just totally in a different field. And I had no awareness of hip hop blogs whatsoever. I knew about, like, people would talk about hip hop on forums, but there wasn't a ton of representation of people who were into anime and hip hop. Like, I remember talking to a dude about Flowbots on an anime forum, and that's about it. So like, I only really caught on to hip hop in a big way because of Anthony Fantano, putting on lots of stuff at a time when I was into Kendrick Lamar. Like, a friend got me into Kendrick, and then because Fantano liked Kendrick, I checked out some of the hip hop stuff that he liked and got into some of that. But it was mostly the weirder experimental stuff. So like, early on, I was trying to make shit that sounds like clipping and death grips, and ultimately just like, I did not have the chops to make that shit. Like, those guys really know what they're doing. Like, they're real ass musicians doing really advanced shit. And I was trying to do, like, the most home cooked, like, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing at all version of that. And so it came out just sounding like total ass. And then ultimately, I started relying on the fact that my little brother Shade just started making beats like out of nowhere. Like, he just starts making beats, and I thought they were dope, so I started rapping on his beats. And I put together an album called Bedroom Bedrock, and it went over surprisingly well with, like, some of my more tapped in fans, with my family. Like, my brother Victor made some music videos that were pretty fun for it. So like, it really got me hyped on this idea of like, maybe I can do this rap shit, like maybe I'm pretty decent at this. And so, hyping myself up, Shade had a few more beats, so I did Above the Earth Haunted, an EP, a couple months later. And then I started working towards, like, I want to have like a major album, like a 13 track, like real doozy album that's like pop songs that are like made to hit. And that led to Gay and Dead. And Gay and Dead ended up being like, I had a few beats from Shade, but he just wasn't really producing. Like, he kind of fell off with making beats all the time. And my friend Sarah Louise, known as Blind Skywatcher as a producer, was cranking out beats at the time. And I ended up going directly to her place, and we made like 7 songs in a week or something like that. Like, making a song every single day, and generated this album that, compared to anything else I've done, is a hit. At the time, it didn't feel that way because I thought I would keep growing. Like, I thought I would make another bigger project after that. But Gay and Dead is still the most popular one I've ever done, which is unfortunate because I don't even really think it's that good. It was very time and place. I understand why people like it because, again, it was designed to be like a pop thing. It was designed to be like the most accessible thing to the audience I had at the time. And after that point, I've done everything other than that. But also, immediately after Gay and Dead is when I started adventuring because, like I said, I had really run out of things to say. At age 25, I had exhausted talking about my life as I understood it. Like, I re-summarized my life in this video in a way I wouldn't have then because I didn't understand it that much. And so, I had basically told all the stories I felt I had inside of me, and I felt like I needed more perspective to be able to, reach more people. And I started traveling. I started a relationship that kind of sidetracked my development in many ways, but also helped it in other ways. Went from that into other relationships that also sidetracked and helped in certain ways and other ways. But, ultimately I found myself at a place where I feel like I am in a consistent period of growth where like I'm in a stable environment, and so all I've been doing is working on myself, you know? And it's like just constant upticks of perspective and a feeling like if I don't like let any of this out, nobody's gonna be able to follow where this fucking journey is going, you know? Like if it starts going too fast. But at the same time, it's hard to summarize and parse it down to something digestible, which is why this video is like this. I promise this is like the 10th attempt I've made at a video that resembles this in the last year, but this is really me trying to make sure that we're on the same page when we get into 2026. And I haven't even really started unveiling plans or anything like that. We're making clarities about what I actually expect from 2026. Back in 2020 was when I realized that I was going to need to start a social gender transition in order to be comfortable with myself in the long term. And this doesn't necessarily mean that I have to be like seen as a woman by all people at all times in order to be comfortable. I don't really give a fuck what other people think. But it is important to me that in order to achieve the full range of my expression, sometimes I do things that other people will consider womanly or will decide makes you more of a woman. Because as much as men like to say, you know, like bigoted men like to say that trans women are not women, they also like to say that effeminate men are not men. So I don't know where they really want you to land with that. Ultimately, I think gender identity is something that should be deconstructed thoroughly going into the future, but that's going to be a slow process because there is a lot of control dynamics boiled into all of that. Misogyny runs very, very, very structurally deep, and it's not something that you're going to dismantle just by calling it what it is. Nonetheless, I think that my gender transition is mostly about overcoming my own internalized misogyny, overcoming my own inner boundaries that I had set up about what makes a man, what makes a woman, what should be expected of either of those two things categorically, what should be expected of me if I am to be recognized as one or the other. Just literally saying fuck all of that. I'm just gonna be myself and do what makes sense. Like I said, if I look more feminine, I go in the women's bathroom if there's only two options, because men are way weirder about who is in their bathroom than women are. Women, by and large, don't give a fuck because they have individual stalls and they're not whipping their dicks out in the middle of the fucking room. Men are super weird about the bathroom because they're whipping their dicks out in the middle of the room. It's why I've always been uncomfortable in the men's room my entire life. That said, I've been in the men's room my entire life. I'm used to that discomfort. So if I don't look especially feminine, I'm just gonna go in the men's room because I'm used to that, you know, and I'm not trying to. Honestly, there's urinals are easy to use, especially if you're in the right clothes. So like, you know, I'm not trying to sit on a public toilet every fucking time I have to take a piss, and I have to piss all the fucking time. I have to piss almost everywhere I go. I have a tiny, tiny bladder. I drink a lot of black coffee. I always have to piss. So the trans bathroom question is in my mind all the fucking time. And it's a decision I make very quickly, depending on the location I'm in. I feel like collectively, most people in the United States have decided that they can't handle the heat, so they're staying out of the kitchen. And I can't blame them for that because the heat is nuclear. But if you don't cook your own food, you eat what you're served. And we've been getting served shit in the United States. And a lot of people are just eating shit and pretending that it's steak. Now, I don't even think, you know, eating steak all the time is the best way to live. I know because I've done it a few times because my husband loves steak and he'll grill it every day for a summer as he did once. It's too much. Heartburn. Like there's physical consequences to indulgence. You really living your best life doesn't mean peaking 24/7. It means finding a rhythm of movement that suits the orchestra of life. So, I need to stop. I was about to try to continue that metaphor, and it's gonna get ugly. I've expended a lot of mental effort and time towards trying to figure out what is my place in this big old world of ours. Where do I fit in? Where do I belong as the girl from nowhere, as queen dissociative, as a person with no intrinsic set of values who basically has to choose my own adventure? Where am I trying to go? And that's something I've really been struggling with, especially lately, because I don't actually have that much power to experiment. And for a long time I did. Like honestly, I the biggest privilege I've had in my life is I have had more room to experiment. I've been granted more room to experiment, I should say, than almost anybody else imaginable. I am the definition of a mad scientist. My funding comes from random crazy people on the internet. Like by and large, most of the people who actually pay me are crazy. And like y'all know, you made it 6 hours into this video. You're crazy. Like so this whole venture is crazy from top to bottom. But it's good crazy. It's health crazy. It's when you're sick and you get the antidote is like the stronger virus or whatever that your body is okay with, but the virus isn't. Antibody. I'm an antibody. I have never found a physical location that I feel normal inside of as much as I do in this room that I'm in right now, in the sense that this is a space that I have no questions about my ability to be myself in this space. In as much as there's not that much that really there is to myself, like there's not something bigger that I need to express than what I can in this space, which I don't think is true for everybody. But there are things I can imagine myself doing in bigger spaces, but not necessarily because I created those spaces. Rather, there are extant spaces that I feel a sense of belonging, mostly conventions. Like when a space is a convention space, specifically, especially if it's like a nerd hobby convention space, I feel welcome there, in a way that I don't in casual society. But also sometimes, if you're just in like a dense enough city environment, it's hard to feel like there's anything that doesn't go. Being in the streets of Seattle, particularly, like you see literally every imaginable type of person there, like in a way that I don't think is true anywhere else I've been in the United States. Um, so, you know, there's certain spaces where I feel like I would be more welcome, but they're not free or they're not cheap or they're not in perpetuity. And like, so there's always a need to be on the move if I don't want to stay exactly right here in this room. And this is not itself a permanent space. It also requires maintenance and the environment around it changes. But, you know, the the if I want to experience more than just the feeling of safety I get from this room, it has to be planned movement. And I used to do much more chaotic movement because I used to really take advantage of every liberty to just throw my resources and opportunities at whatever was in front of me. And after having, suffered a lot of consequences from that, now I try to move much more tactically and slowly and with planning. And so I'm not trying to make random throws here. I'm trying to carefully craft a 2026. I'm not jumping into it. You know, I didn't try to, at the last minute of 2025, go, oh, let me really quick schedule a whole 2026 for myself. No, 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 no. We're here already. I've got nothing planned for this year except for to continue projects I was already working on. So, in the effort of making plans for this year, I will be opening a conversation with you about what you think my plans should be for 2026 because I am a representative. I stand for you. Whoever made it this far into this video, you are who I represent culturally. My job is to make your life better, whether that's just by entertaining you through content or whether that's through becoming the president of the United States and changing circumstances to make them better for you, my core constituency. So, what do you need from me? That's what I need to know. What do you need from me? And how do we make that work? It's not a one-stop conversation. If it's too much work, if you're like, I don't need that much from you, just keep making videos, whatever, that's fine. But the more engagement you put in, the more you'll get out of it, and the more I'll get out of it. So I want to know, what can we plan? What makes sense? What have you been dying to see? You know, what do you think is supposed to be? What would be your vision of 2026 as part of the body that is the Trixie mechanism? What's the word I want? Not mechanism. Organism. Yeah. As part of the Trixie organism, what would you want to see in 2026? I'm going to talk about the things that have been compelling me the most lately. Like I said, studying movement, particularly geography, and also like electricity, the nature of matter, the nature of cells. I want to learn more about brain chemistry and like how thought works, like why is thought possible? What are other creatures other than humans thinking about? And like how can we inspire them? And that would be interesting. That's like a far-flung field of thought, but I don't know how much is even being put into researching that. I also have been very dedicated to learning hip-hop history because it is not that well documented. There are certain people who know all of it, and I would like to at least know enough to get into the conversation with those people to be a part of that preservation of history. And in particular, I want to study the movement of hip-hop because there's a lot of understanding from individual people about what happened in their place, but I want to see the macro movement. You know, it started from the Bronx. It took like 5 years for it to permeate New York City. It took another 5 years for it to permeate, you know, the next few cities it made it to. I've been studying this, but like, you know, getting into the movement of hip hop geography is something that really interests me. And also just improving my own craft as an artist. You know, I want to be able to perform live. I did my first live shows in 2021. I did 2 shows a week apart that went well, but they taught me a tremendous amount about what what doing a live performance is and what it means and what I would have to do to make it fun for myself consistently. Like doing the kind of show that I did, like it made me realize first of all that my discography really wasn't even built for live shows. You know, like it was a discography made for being in your bedroom. It's bedroom music for bedroom people, you know. And so like doing those shows made me realize that there was only like 5 or 6 songs I even had that I could perform live, and they weren't all songs that I necessarily loved or would want to perform over and over again, you know. So as I've built out my catalog, I've thought a lot more about the circumstances the song is meant for. Is this a live song? Is this meant for the bedroom? Is this meant for who is this meant for? You know, like, is this supposed to play in the car? Like, where can this be listened to? And it's different purposes for different projects, but I have plenty now of live songs that I could do and like, and have a good time doing them, you know? And so, like, when I imagine the environment I'd want to perform in as well, like, I imagine it's easier for my music to go over with like nerds and convention goers and people who are going to get more of the references in my lyrics. But a lot of those people don't really listen to hardcore hip hop like that, you know? And I think it might take a little longer for there to be enough crossover between like hardcore nerd culture and hardcore hip hop culture before my stuff's really going to start connecting with people. But I'm betting on that long run, and I'm just catalog building. You know, like, all I do is, I write songs, I make them, I put them out. Maybe one of them one day is going to be someone's favorite song. You know, Anxiety by Doechii was a 4 years later, you know, like, mixtape song that suddenly became massive. So, you know, I'm putting a lot of eggs in the basket of, as long as I keep building my back catalog, there's always more chances that someone's going to find something interesting that, you know, that they might tell other people about later. I definitely have several projects, like, outside of music and inside of music, that I'm like just waiting for the day that that more people find it. Not that I'm expecting any of them to be like massively famous, but there are some things I've done that basically have no plays, you know, that I'm like, I know there's a cult following for this out there. It just hasn't been found yet. But you know, as long as I keep making that kind of stuff, then, you know, it's another roll of the dice. Hopefully it happens before I'm dead. When it comes to talking about media, which I feel like is what I'm best known for, I've been having a lot of struggle with the fact that most of the media that anyone is curious about or is talking about is released through major corporations that I just absolutely have contempt for. And I do not believe that talking about them in that contemptuous manner does the most you can to like actually like disaffect them. Like, you have to ignore them. You have to actually not consume the media, actually not talk about the media or promote it in order for it to go away, you know? And it's not that they will never fail on something like a Morbius where, like, you know, they spend a lot of money and it tanks and everybody makes fun of it. And they think that, oh, well, now it's a meme, so we'll put it back in theaters and it tanks again. Like, sometimes the execs are that dumb. But, like, Sony's still around, you know? And every time, even if I was talking about, like, Spider-Verse, right? Like, I legitimately love that movie. And, like, there's a bunch of Marvel Universe stuff that I legitimately love, but like talking about it fills me with a sense of guilt of like, this is literally doing less for me than it is for these companies. Like, I get paid jack shit to talk about these movies, and you know, I haven't in years, I have not had like a major success talking about a major franchise. Like, it gets more attention than talking about indie stuff, but not enough so that it's like, oh well, you know, it's keeping the lights on, so I guess I'm indebted to these companies. It's like, nah, they treat me like shit. You know, they take my videos down. They establish no personal relationships with me. You know, like, I could literally make a whole video about how good a Sony movie is, and it's going to get my channel taken down. You know, so like, to me, it's like literally supporting an abusive relationship to keep supporting these companies. And I almost never spend money on media, and I kind of look down on it as a hobby or a habit. Just a little bit. Sorry. Because I know a lot of y'all do that. Collect media. It's different if it's indie. Like, this shirt, I bought this from the band. You know, like, I saw this band, never heard of them, Gouge Away. They were an opener for Touche Amore at a show in Rochester in like 2018. Never heard of them, thought they were great. The woman who was the front woman was selling the shirts. She looked amazing. I was very happy to spend like $10, $15 or whatever this costed. That's different. Buying something from a major corporation is like you are empowering them to keep fucking you over. And you know you're doing it. But you do it anyways. And that's why they can keep fucking you over. So like, to me, it is innately unhealthy to promote these major things if they are not going to give back or, you know, at least allow you to operate in that ecosystem. Like, anime is the worst. You know, Nintendo's pretty bad, and those are the things I grew up with as like my major compulsions, you know? So like, if anime hadn't treated me so poorly, I feel like I would still be talking about anime. If, you know, if Nintendo didn't treat their fans so poorly, I would probably be a Nintendo person. But like, as it stands, I mostly enjoy supporting independent media. But again, it's really hard to make a career being a person who supports independent stuff when that independent stuff is already struggling on its own to make money. And they don't want you siphoning off of their audience, you know? Like, so it's difficult to make that like your central identity is like, oh, I'm a promoter of things that are not popular, you know? Like, well, how do you get popular talking about unpopular things? Most people try to strike a balance of like do a little bit of popular, a little bit of not popular, and like mix it up. But that especially gets difficult if the popular and unpopular things don't really have connected communities. And that was what I discovered as I kept making anime videos was I could make a video about, you know, a popular show that would get 1 million views, and then if I make a video about an unpopular show, it's going to get 100,000 views at the most, you know? And it just makes you feel like you can't make those videos because you're financially dependent on getting as many views as possible, unless you can somehow, you know, market your video in a way that tricks people into watching something they didn't realize would be interesting. And people got way better at that in like 2019, 2020. Like, there was a period of time where the meta on YouTube shifted from, you know, talk about big, obvious, popular thing to just like make a catchy statement with your title and thumbnail. Like, just invite people into a vibe or a world that they want to inhabit. And that's how we market videos now. And I kind of haven't really caught on to that trend still because the way I do things since then has been so scattershot. It has been so unplanned. It has been so many Hail Mary throws and experimental gambits and let's see how this works and, you know, like just all kinds of different stuff that I've been up to since 2020. So in 2020 was the first time that I ever met somebody who was capable of rapping about as well as I can. And that was how I got the connections to do those shows and to have those realizations about myself as a rapper. And in that period was where I started to realize that, like, if this thing is important enough to me to be doing, I have to do it at a level that is respectful to the craft itself. Like, it basically made me realize that there's tons of people who are good at this, that like being really good at rapping is not even really that unique of a quality. You have to build an entire, like, you have to basically be a good entrepreneur in order to be a successful rapper. Like, or you have to know a good entrepreneur and have a really good trust relationship with them. You know, like, those are how you get successful in the music industry, is you either are a good business person or you have a great relationship with a good business person, or you just get taken advantage of, you know, and you look successful from the outside, but you don't really feel successful. Those are the ways that you end up with, you know, with money and connections in the industry. And so, you know, as I started finding myself at the foot level of that, I kind of realized, like, if I want to be a part of this, I have to really understand what I'm trying to do here. You know, like, what is my purpose in this? And that's why I've leaned towards like learning history, kind of making those more macro connections and kind of focusing on stuff that is harder to notice if you're like inside of it. You know, the stuff that the unique stuff that an outsider can bring to a culture, is what I want to focus on, because I am the outsider who but like this is the thing that I feel the closest connection to and the most personal interest in and respect for, because it is my favorite American art form. And having grown up with mostly Japanese media, I feel like, I never developed enough of a cultural relationship to Japan to feel as though I would actually fit in there. Like, even though I was so inspired by Japanese media growing up, because of the fact that I come from such an alternative, household. Like, it's funny to think now, right? Because we're more normalized to Japanese culture in America now because it is now normal to like Japanese culture. But it was not normal when I was a kid, especially not the anime stuff. So, like, to me, Japanese stuff felt outside of the norm. But when you actually look at the relationship of like anime to Japanese people, it is also outsider culture there. Like, being into anime, there's certain anime that it is normal to be into for certain people, but like, overall the like stereotypical anime fan, the otaku, is an outsider in Japan and also an outsider in the United States. And so while I connect to that outsider culture of Japan, I did not get the sense that I would actually fit in more in Japan, particularly because I'm a loud person with a very singular personality. Like, I've never been trying to fit in or really understood how I would fit in. And Japan is a very fit in type of a place, Even their outsiders fit in more than, than an American would. So, when I realized that, like, I'm not very good at learning language, and so like my Japanese is incredibly spotty, but like, not to say that I don't think I could fare in Japan. I think I'd be able to get around, but like, I couldn't like live there, and build relationships and everything with my level of Japanese. But more than that, I just feel like culturally, I'm more likely to get along with Americans who are into Japanese culture than I am to get along with Japanese people in Japan. And so like I became more focused on like who within the environment that I actually exist inside of has a culture that I want to be a part of. Like, I don't really like necessarily being around lots of anime fans because most of them don't have the same taste in anime as me. I don't necessarily like being around, like broad, like people who just consider themselves an anime fan or just a fan of manga. You probably are not into the same stuff I am. And most of the people who are, I got them into it, like holistically, I mean. Not to say that, like, obviously Kill La Kill, very successful show, right? But like, if your favorite anime are Kill La Kill, Log Horizon, and fucking Lucky Star, like, that's because you're a fan of me. Like, you wouldn't be a fan of that specific circle of shows. But there is a circle of shows that is like Trixie Core, that is, here's the stuff that people who found out about anime through me are into. And that is a taste that basically I created. But like, that made it easier for me to exist in that space online where there's more people who understand me because they're acclimated to my tastes. But that doesn't translate to there being like a real life anime club where that's the culture there. Like, it never got to that level of my taste being the commanding taste culturally. It's just a taste that exists. So I don't feel as though like I could walk into a room full of anime fans and feel as though I'm going to have that deep of a connection to them. Whereas if I walk into a room full of specifically fans of what's a fan base I feel like I really would get along with. Um, well, like right now, well, okay, I don't want to say that either. Damn, this is tough. I want to say Cleo Reed, right? Like, Cleo Reed's a musician I'm a big fan of, who's relatively new, so she doesn't have a whole bunch of like people who suck who are fans of her, as far as I know. So like I'm sure if I went to a Cleo Reed concert, I'd be like, everyone in this room is cool, you know. But for the most part, there's not a lot of stuff that I'm into where I feel like I could show up there and everyone else there is gonna have much in common with me other than we like this one thing, you know. But the closest I get to that feeling is in conventions, and that's why I feel more comfortable in that space, and why like I imagine myself if I was going to have a job that is not sit in front of a computer screen and talk at a camera for the rest of my life, it would involve performing in a convention space, whether that is both speaking and rapping or one or the other. All of it is something I'd be interested to do. And it's something I've seen other people do, you know, or have done to some capacity and think is fun. Um, I just haven't really figured out where specifically do I want to go? What rhythm? What lane? What does it cost? How am I funding it? Slash, am I getting paid? Slash, like, how do I get my foot in the door? Who do I need to talk to? Like, I don't know any of that. And I've been so worried about getting my internet career figured out that I haven't been even trying to look into that stuff, even though that is kind of where I really want to be, you know, because I'm more interested in the travel and getting to be in front of people and like get that energy than I am in, you know, talking to a phone for 4 hours that I might not like. This will get released, but oftentimes it's like 2 hours in, I'm like, no, this fucking sucks. I don't want to have to hear this again, you know. I'm gonna try to wrap this up as quickly as I can because I've been doing this all day. My husband's gonna get home at some point, and I don't want to still be recording this vlog. So I want to really zero in on the core stuff, the core ideas at the heart of this, making you understand where I'm at next year, where I want things to go next year, in a very broad sense. I would like us all to try to focus on making things healthier for ourselves in every sense of trying to recognize and enact a plan for improving your diet, improving your level of movement. And by that, I don't mean going outside. I mean like stretching and making sure that like you don't sit for like 3 hours at a time without standing up at some point. Like just, you know, baby steps towards making yourself more mobile. Increased mobility through society. And again, I don't necessarily mean physical movement, but your mobility. How do you gain mobility? Through trust, through trust relationships. Trust is what builds social mobility. You need to be more trustworthy. You need to invite more trust more people, and you're not always going to get a good return on your trust investments. But if you never make any and you never learn how to develop trust, you'll never have it. And trust is the foundation of society. Trust, first of all, when I say trust, I am inclusive of the word money. Like that is a trust, a form of trust. It is everything you own is a trust, you know, but also what you have between you and other people is trust relationships. When you sell something, that is a trust relationship. You trust that this person is not going to gun you down and take the money after they get the thing from you. You know, like you trust that you both are humans in society together. That's why you have to constantly check with the little weather questions to make sure the people you're dealing with are actually humans and not trying to fuck with you, not trying to backstab you. You got to suss them out. Develop trust relationships. Know who to trust. Know who not to trust, and in what circumstances. What should you trust certain people with, and what should you not trust certain people with? You should not trust me with an oven that I walk away from. Don't think, oh, she must have set a timer. Think, she has totally forgotten that she put something in the oven, and I should remind her. Trust. If you don't trust yourself with something, find someone you can trust with it. If you don't trust yourself with your health, look for a trustworthy source on health that you can reference. Learn how to vet sources. Learn how to be curious. When you don't know something, don't try to figure it out in your brain. Look it up. Don't like try to make up a reason of why something is. Actually investigate why it is. I really have been trying to express myself in lots of different ways through what I create. And I often feel like the broad perspective of what am I trying to accomplish is like lost or is hazy to people. And I feel like they view each thing I do as just like its own independent thing that can just be engaged with on its own and it has nothing to do with the rest of it. Whereas from my perspective, it's all one thing. You know, it's just me making my perspective clearer one step at a time. And I feel like when I release something and it doesn't connect with the segment of my audience that does connect with another part, it makes me somewhat confused, not because I don't understand why they wouldn't connect with it, but why they're not curious too. Why don't they want to be into my music if they're not into it? Or if they're not into, if they're not watching videos because of they haven't seen this media, why haven't they? Isn't the fact that I made a video about it, does that not make them curious enough to want to check it out? Or, did I not do a good enough job of signaling to people that they should be curious about this thing before I made that much dedication towards it? I want to call my shots more ahead of time, but that also requires me to be less flighty, less experimental, less willing to say, oh, well, I'm not in the mood to do what I already said I was going to do. I'm going to do something else now, like, or this isn't working. I need to abandon it, before it reaches its full potential because I'm desperate. I have to be trusting that the thing is going to happen before I even step foot in it. Right now, what I want to do for 2026 is mostly focus on not creating new things, but going through the many, many unreleased things I have and getting them to a state of release, because I am in a position right now where I have more to lose by making up something new than I do by, releasing something I already made and maybe it doesn't go over that well. At least it's not like me creating an entirely new production that didn't go over that well, like I have tons of stuff saved up that I just haven't set the time aside to like complete. So I want to get through my backlog. I want to continue series that I already have going, such as Nova's anime blog, Taking Minutes on Turn 8 Gundam, the stuff that I've been doing with Krona, where we already have like a well underway, edit of this Dragon Quest 1 video. We've also been doing live streams on the Slime Dolls channel. We're going to, do another one with Metroid Dread soon. I've got my Samus vs. Samus audiobook that I want to convert into a video series. The first one I converted, I will eventually make all of them into videos. And, I have other projects in the vein of that I might launch into eventually. But again, I am sitting on so much incomplete content that introducing new stuff at this point is ludicrous. I have books that have been incomplete for years. I have video projects that are half written that are just waiting to be restructured into something workable. So again, making up new shit has been a problem for me, and there's not really anything new going on right now. Like, there's not anything happening in the zeitgeist that I need to chase. The next anime season is going to be a big deal because it's a bunch of anime that are already popular. Friren's going to have another season, Jujutsu Kaisen's got another season, Jigokuraku's got another season, and like, my stance on all these shows is like, if you gave a fuck, you should have read the manga by now. Like, I started off my members only video series with anime onlys are literally bad people, and you can watch that to get my full stance on it. But like, I've read so far ahead of Frieren that I'm not really intrigued by the fact that there's an anime coming out about it. I'd rather catch up on the fucking manga. Which I haven't read in like a year. So, yeah, like, to me, the anime YouTube space is somewhat interesting because people are telling some cool stories and making some cool videos. I promote stuff in my post tab all the time that I think is interesting, but it's not a space that I really see myself inhabiting. I feel like I've told my anime stories. I'm having fun hearing other people's, but like there's nothing going on in the world of anime that makes me think, oh, I have to talk about this. Like, it's cool that Free Red is so successful, but I really don't encourage you to even like buy its merchandise. It's already like beyond the pale of what was ever necessary, you know? So yeah, like it's not supporting the creators of Freerun to make him like you don't need to make him a fucking billionaire or whatever or support like this massive industry of stuff that's clinging on to this one guy had all these great ideas and now fucking 100,000 people are making a whole industry out of selling you crap based on that guy's ideas. Like I don't know, I just don't really have respect for the anime industry like that. You should look at the camera, Banshee. Look over there. Look at, look at that. Look up, Banshee. Look up. She won't look up. Well, she seems to be settling in. She's gonna get fur all over me. All right, get out of here. You're digging your claws in too much. This is obnoxious. Yeah, aside from trying to get my projects wrapped up, like I said, I want to develop more of a schedule for this year. I want, to make more of a rollout for the things that I release. I want to recontextualize some of the stuff that I've put out before and maybe, get more eyeballs on some things that I've made that I just never. I have a problem of not really promoting my stuff. Like I make it and then it just exists. And then usually I don't know how happy I am with it until later, but then sometimes I feel like, damn, that was really good and nobody ever paid attention to it. How do I like get more people to notice? So I want to do more of that, like focus on my back catalog and just all the great stuff I've already done that I just haven't really brought the full potential out of yet. Because again, it's not that I wouldn't want to make something that's very fresh and new and like tapping on the zeitgeist. I just don't see anything interesting happening right now. Everyone's bitching about AI, which is a bubble that's just gonna pop and then we'll never hear about it, for 10 more years, and then it'll come back and then we'll hear about it again. Just like VR will come back and we'll hear about it and then it'll disappear and we'll hear about it. And it's these technologies cannot move at the speed that capitalism wants them to, and so it's just like these massive clouds of money hovering in the sky that end up turning into like toxic rain, and when it rains down, it doesn't have the same value it had before it went up into the cloud. So this is a weird inflation metaphor. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that, like, I think that there's a lot of interesting art being created right now, but there's not a lot of interesting community around art happening right now because it still feels like most people just want to hear about like a familiar topic. And so, even though the monocultural things are no longer successful, talking about them still is. Like, talking about Drake is more successful than Drake is, which is a weird paradigm to be in. But you can make more money, studying pop culture than you can making pop culture, or at the very least, you have way less overhead. And it's really hard to make something pop right now because what is culture? Like culture is anxiety. That's why like Dochi's anxiety song is like one of the most recent things that really felt like a natural emergence of like people just finding something that resonated and going, oh, it's this is what it is right now. It's just raw anxiety. And so I do think that there's a sense in which culture has caught up to me where it's easier for me to operate in society now because stuff that, like, people who think like me and communicate like me have become way more commonplace, where like studying psychology, even assuming that there is something to know about your own mind, is like much more mainstream. You know, there is way more uh public discourse around anxiety, around depression, around the idea that there are reasons to be upset, you know, at the world. There are reasons to doubt the government. There are reasons to doubt the mainstream narrative, and they aren't because you're like a crazy conspiracy theorist or like a right wing person, you know? Like, there is legitimately so much nuance to the world that you really do need to study it to understand it. And, you know, I think that I make a pretty good guide through perspective on what's happening, but it's hard to talk about any specific thing and then another specific thing and expect the same people to care about both of those things, because most people are hyper focused, and it's not even really of their own accord. It's like the algorithm trying to make you that way. Like, if you express an interest in something, the algorithm wants you obsessed with it. If you watch a video about Drake, you're going to see every video about Drake. If you watch a video about a video game you happen to be playing, you are now going to be fed every video about that game, and it's like totally going to take you into its world. And I feel like everybody's got a few little things that they're a part of, but they're not all in on any of those things because it's so algorithmically determined. You know, it's like you in your house, and then you have like this tangential relationship to this thing happening elsewhere. And even with like trans culture, like, so much of it is just like small communities in Seattle and Minneapolis that have that kind of strength in numbers there to create something that can succeed online. But then you've got people who are copying that elsewhere, and there's just no momentum there to like to be that type of a person, you know? So like, I think the internet creates a lot of illusions where people think that something is happening like in a cultural way or in a mainstream way that's actually just happening in one place, but everyone can see it because of the internet, you know? And I think we're going to realize a lot more focus on talking about locality and what is unique about where you live. I think that's going to grow a lot in the coming years, as people figuring out, like, oh, way more of my circumstances than I realized are unique to me. You know, like, I've always thought that everything that made me different was like incidental, but actually everyone's different from the proposed normal. And, you know, there are certain things that are normal where I am from that are not normal in other places, and that might be for the better or the worse. But like, the more we communicate about that, the more that we'll see evolution and movement between places, movement of ideas and literal people. I think that on a political level, um, I think that humans should be treated better than banks. And I think that humans should have all the same rights that banks have. And so, you know, as a human being, if you make a loan to someone and they don't pay that loan back, you should be able to borrow that money back from the Fed. Or not borrow, you should get that, you know, the Fed should compensate your bad loan like they do with banks. Like, as an American citizen, you should have every right that a corporation or a bank has. If a corporation or a bank is going to be recognized as a citizen should also be recognized as a corporation or a bank. And on a physiological level, that just makes sense, because you are not one physical solid organism. You are a collection of billions of microorganisms that's constantly changing. So to even draw a line around the biomatter that constructs your current, you know, like, frame of self, you are basically a bank. You know, you are a bank that is constantly trading molecules. And so I think that every person, especially because the stuff inside of you all has literal monetary value, there's no reason to consider a person as not a bank. And in a legal sense, every bank should have equal access to federal backing. So I think that the Fed should be basically making life possible for every U.S. citizen because they have the ability. The Fed can balance the books so that the money is spread in a way that it doesn't even have to be spread evenly. I'm not even asking for evenly. I'm asking for you could cut off half of a billionaire's funding and make everyone who works for them live cushy, and that billionaire still gets to be a billionaire. So like you can easily restructure the Fed to make it so that it pays for America. What's the word? Subsidizes Americans' existence. The American citizenship should be considered so valuable that just being an American citizen means that you are a asset and you are therefore invested in by the Fed. The Fed should be constantly invested in every individual person in the country. So that's my proposition for what I will do to fix the government as president is I will treat you with the same gratitude as which we treat banks. You will have your entire existence subsidized if you are a U.S. citizen. And citizenship will not be that difficult to obtain. Ultimately, we want everyone in the world to have the same level of class that a U.S. citizen has. So, we want more of them. We want a full squad. We want a whole world of U.S. citizens. Everybody should be inclusive of us. Us should be inclusive of everybody. So, that's the goal. Is I don't think that white people will last another 50 years. That's just inevitable. I don't think that our current conceptions of our countries will last another 100 years. That's just inevitable. So, let's work to make it happen the best way it can. Let's not just let it, be controlled by a few people at the top. Let's empower ourselves to have some decision making in how this all plays out. And it takes a lot of people deciding that they just simply ain't gonna take it. And, some people might die along the way. I feel like if I die at any point before, like, the life expectancy of an average American, people will be like, see? You can't live different. You can't live outside the rules. You can't just be a creative. Some people are just going to say, well, she had privilege, so whatever, and fair. I did have some privilege, a lot of privilege. But I also have just been determined. It's not that it wouldn't have been easier to just go do things normal style. But, you got to refuse. Going into 2026, I feel less and less like my problem is not finding, like, categorically the right thing to talk about so much as categorically doing just the wrong type of media. And by that I don't mean that I shouldn't be doing vlogs. I love doing vlogs, and I record them and throw them away sometimes just because it's a good way for me to get my thoughts out of my head. But what I do mean is that I basically, when I was a teen, had aspirations of writing music, had aspirations of writing novels, had aspirations of creating magazines, and when I found that I would write my anime blog more than anything else, like it was just a natural course of action, I decided, like, well, okay, what if I could make money off of that? That would be cool because, I always just end up doing it one way or another. And so once I figured out how to convert my blog posts into YouTube videos, that became the new natural tendency. Is like, well, I come up with these ideas, I turn them into blog posts, I turn the blog posts into videos. That's now my career. That's what I do. That's who I am. And then I started experimenting with, well, I still want to be a musician, but I wasn't really sure what my identity was in that realm, and I had a lot of growth to do, so it took a long time for me to really like even think that my music was worth throwing my weight behind as a creative endeavor. And then, I started teaching myself to enjoy writing fiction more, but I still have a very tenuous relationship with fiction where, like, it's tough for me to actually enjoy the process of writing it. I like having ideas. Actually, writing fiction can feel really weird. So, it's rare that it's something I actually find myself doing, and I can't imagine doing it as a deliberate career as much as just something that I would do because I'm passionate about it as an art form. Um, but like when it comes to what do I do to make money, to engage with an audience, like I feel as though for a long time I've let my consumption be too guided by what I thought would help me to connect with my audience more, where like I would watch a ton of anime that I don't really care about that much, just hoping that if I like something enough to talk about it, then that'll be something I can connect with people over. But like most of what I actually consume is other YouTube videos and music. And those are both things that are kind of hard to just talk about in the way that I talk about anime, and reach the same kind of an audience. So I've spent a long time like trying to develop, well, how would I, communicate with people in those fields? How would I evolve what I do to reach a new set of people? And like there just isn't already a paradigm in place. Like there just simply is not someone doing something that resembles what I think I am trying to do. And so I have to stop trying to operate within the lines of not only what other people have already done, but also what I've already done. Like I can't assume that I just need to talk about a different topic in the same style and eventually people will care, or oh, I need to adapt in this way or another to like the trends of the moment. I don't think that I'm going to create a trend. I think I'm going to create a niche, something that is very specific to me, that nobody else is doing, that nobody else would or could or would want to do. And I will be the only person doing it. And maybe it will be something that is dependent on the internet. Maybe it will be something that has an internet presence but isn't actually dependent on it. But one way or another, it will stay being online because I am an online person. I grew up on the internet and I have an intense relationship with it. But I also like value being in reality very heavily, and I value being outside and being in visible spaces and being in actual tactile communities very highly as well. And so whatever I am trying to build, it necessarily will involve some kind of travel, some kind of movement, some kind of physical engagement, and navigating exactly what all of that, like what is the level of all of that, has been the difficult part, but is also where I'm going to put my energies. And again, I'm not trying to rush into anything because trying to find a new gimmick all the time has, really just been spinning my wheels, and like nothing ever hits. Like I've done so many ideas where when I started doing live streams last year, like that was a zeitgeist writing moment. It was like, oh, vertical live streams are hitting, so I'm going to jump on that bandwagon, and it hit for a little bit. And then I started doing horizontal live streams, and it's like I'm kind of bandwagoning on a few like successful indie cartoons, but it's just like nothing has been like this really got them, this really got the audience, or even myself. None of it's been something where I'm like, oh, I'm committed to doing this for the next 5 years. So I really want to take a step back and focus on that. Like, what is something I could do that I would be committed to long term? And I think that the only way I'll be able to identify that is if I focus on, my work being get through my backlog. My work is not make up a new thing to make money. My work is keep the reliable engine afloat while you figure out the next stage of life. Um, but, aside from the projects that I am still, wrapping up and the backlog stuff. I don't have that next stage planned. I don't know what the next thing is. You know, I don't know what people even really think I'm up to right now. You know, like I've got a bunch of different channels and I'm doing a bunch of different stuff on all of them. I don't know how much awareness there is of anything I'm working on. I don't know how much awareness there is of anything I've done in the last couple of years. So that's a big thing I want to do as well, is like raise awareness of what I have actually been up to, finish the things I've been up to, and then figure out the next stage from there. And in the meanwhile, what I want to see from other people is trying to build more trust relationships, trying to pull yourself away from the screen, not necessarily to go outside, but just to take more care of your physical body, because when that thing's gone, you're gone, you know? And if you're just trying to burn as bright as you can until it's over, that's fine too. But, you know, I'm here for the long haul, and I want to know who's going to be here with me when all is said and done. So I'd like to get my squad together. Let's figure it out. Okay, that's it. This has been Trixie. Welcome to 2026. Forever.